Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the silk-draped, gold-inlaid corridors of imperial China, when the Qing Dynasty still stood tall, draped in peacock feathers and powdered formality, oblivious to the slow venom creeping in through its tea leaves and ink scrolls. You're going to walk beside emperors and eunuchs, soldiers and smugglers, and yes, you probably won't survive this. Because history, unlike bedtime, isn't always gentle, but it's fascinating. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I'm always curious about the late night crew. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the polished stone of the Forbidden City's Grand Plaza, early 1800s. The dawn has a peach gold hue, spilling over the vermilion gates. The silence is sacred, only disturbed by the rhythmic slap of guards' boots as they march in coordinated perfection. In this world, the Qing Dynasty reigns supreme, not just over its sprawling empire, but in the illusion of eternal power. The banners flutter with dragons embroidered in gold thread. You're dressed in robes of soft blue silk, a court attendant watching history breathe and hum through ceremonial repetition. It feels like nothing could go wrong, at least not visibly. Inside the palaces, the emperor, currently the Qing Emperor, son of Qianlong, is buried beneath layers of ritual and bureaucracy. He's inherited a system too complex to change and too sacred to question. You pass rooms stacked with tributes from across the empire: bronze gongs from Yunnan, cinnamon bark from Sichuan, jade from Xinjiang. Out in the provinces, Qing law is enforced by mandarins with peacock-feathered hats and long fingernails signalling high status and zero labour. This is a civilization that sees itself as the centre of the world, and frankly, it has a point. China's economy for centuries has been the envy of the globe. The West craves its tea, silk and porcelain. Ship after ship departs Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, filled with crates of fragile beauty and bitterness in perfect balance. In return, the Chinese want almost nothing the West has to offer. European goods? Meh. Western art? No thanks. Their payment is to be in silver, only silver, which means Western nations, especially Britain, are bleeding precious metal just to keep the tea flowing. For you, inside the palace, this imbalance is a non-issue. The tribute ships are still arriving. The treasury, while not bursting, has enough silver to gild a few thousand more dragon statues. The emperor is still bowed to by distant kings and nomads. But out there, across the oceans, Britain is growing deeply frustrated. And when empires get frustrated, they start getting clever, and then dangerous. You walk along the quiet side corridors of the Forbidden City, overhearing a muffled debate. A court official mentions coastal smugglers. Another scoffs. Some whisper about foreign merchants bringing in something strange, smoky, and new. But it's dismissed. A foreign vice, a sailor's habit, nothing serious. What you're hearing, without knowing it, is the very first flicker of the flame that will burn this empire to its foundations. The British have found a solution to their silver problem, and it's wrapped in paper and packed in wooden chests. Opium, specifically Decay Bengal opium cultivated in British-controlled India, is about to become the hottest import in China. Technically illegal under Chinese law, but that doesn't stop the trade. In fact, its illegality makes it more lucrative. You'd think an empire this powerful could just say no and mean it, but you're starting to notice cracks. Local officials are paid off. Coastal villages depend on the trade. And inside the capital, where you serve, rumours grow louder each month that princes themselves are indulging, that soldiers stationed near southern ports are fogged up, slow to respond, too relaxed when they should be alert. You start to see small wooden pipes tucked into sleeves, ash marks near paper lanterns, laughter that lasts too long in the middle of the night. What's so dangerous about a little poppy sap anyway? Here's the strange part. This isn't the first time opium has come to China. The plant was known in ancient times. It had medical uses in small doses, but never before has it arrived in such volume with such aggressive marketing. British merchants aren't just selling drugs, they're building an addiction economy brick by brick under the cover of trade diplomacy and naval power. Still, the imperial court remains aloof. You sit through meetings where aging scholars talk in Confucian riddles, and no one dares mention the opium problem by name. They talk about moral decay or southern distractions. But no imperial decree is issued. The emperor is occupied with internal reforms, secret police reports are filed and then ignored. The scale of what's coming is simply inconceivable. A historian might say this is the beginning of the Qing dynasty's unraveling from within, but that would sound too sudden. What you're witnessing is more like a subtle poisoning, a toxin so slow you keep telling yourself you feel fine right up until you don't. And now, the quirky bit. In some coastal towns, locals start believing opium smoke protects them from evil spirits. Seriously. There's even a strange rumour that ghosts are drawn to its scent, which leads some people to burn it not to get high, but as a spiritual offering. That blend of superstition and vice? A perfect storm. But scholars today still debate this question. Could the Qing have stopped it early, if they'd acted sooner? Was the empire just too arrogant to see the danger? Or did they know deep down that their world was already slipping away, and opium was just the excuse? You don't have an answer yet, but as you walk through the hush of an imperial garden past lotus ponds and whispering bamboo, there's a strange feeling in the air. A stillness before the storm. Something old is about to collapse. Not all at once, and not because of one thing. But opium will be the match. You wake to the sound of bronze bells and the scent of incense curling into the morning light. A new day in the Qing capital, still serene, still gilded, but far from unaware. You've been noticing a shift in tone. At court, the confidence is still there, but it trembles around the edges. Not because of war or rebellion, not yet. It's because silver is disappearing and nobody knows quite where it's all going. So let's take a walk, past the heavy red gates of the Forbidden City, through the alleys of merchant districts, and south toward the coast. Canton is bustling. Not the sleepy fishing village it once was, but a cosmopolitan hub built almost entirely around trade. Here, the British have set up camp. Well, not exactly legally. And not exactly openly, but thoroughly. The foreign merchants live in designated quarters called factories, which sounds industrial but is just a colonial word for walled compounds where we do deals and smoke cigars. You enter one of these factories with the sharp smell of salt and ink in the air. The British are irritable. They sip weak tea, mutter about exchange rates, and scowl at ledgers that don't lie. Silver is draining from their coffers faster than opium leaks from their chests. Why? Because China wants silver and only silver, in exchange for its glorious exports. You glance around. The ships docked along the Pearl River are loaded with porcelain, embroidered silk, and most importantly, tea. Glorious, fragrant, addictive tea. And not just for a few noblemen in England, no. It's become a national obsession. Black tea, green tea, oolong tea, jasmine, Beijing pearls, name your price, Bouchard. As long as you're paying in silver. Back in London, Parliament is losing sleep. The East India Company's ledgers are soaked in red ink. And in those secret back rooms where colonial policy is written in cigar smoke and polished boots, a new plan is forming. If China won't buy what the British make, then Britain will sell what China can't stop using. That brings us to India. You sail from Canton to Calcutta, where poppy fields ripple under a hazy sun. British-controlled India is an empire of extraction, and one of its most profitable crops is opium. The East India Company doesn't just encourage opium farming, it mandates it. Farmers are forced into contracts, prices are fixed, and even those who beg to grow food instead are turned away. You crouch beside one of these farmers, a thin man whose hands are stained from slicing poppy pods at dawn. His children are barefoot. His wife boils leaves into a thin, bitter broth, but the company doesn't care. It wants bricks of opium, pressed, dried, and ready for export. You return to China with one of those ships. Under cover of darkness, near the coast, the smugglers do their work. You watch chests lowered overboard, floated ashore on bamboo rafts, and carried inland on silent shoulders. Opium is now everywhere. In tea houses, inns, military outposts, it creeps in like fog. At first, it seems almost elegant. Small pipes, carved ivory mouthpieces, bowls of sugared fruit passed around while smoke coils lazily toward paper lanterns. But soon it becomes something darker. You walk into a dim opium den where men lie sprawled like broken puppets, their eyes hollow, their movements slowed to a surreal underwater rhythm. Soldiers who should be drilling now lie in stupor. Scholars who should be debating Confucian texts have given up their calligraphy brushes. The empire isn't falling yet, but its spine is softening. Now here's your quirky fact for the night. Some opium smugglers disguised themselves as monks. Seriously, dressed in robes, heads shaved, bowls in hand, they walked freely through checkpoints. No one suspecting the illicit cargo stuffed into their carts. It's so absurd, it's almost elegant. And it worked. Back in Beijing, the emperor begins to sense the silver shortage. You sit in on an emergency council. Ministers speak in cautious tones. They avoid directly blaming the British. After all, diplomacy must be preserved. But one brave official dares to suggest that silver is being siphoned out of the empire at an alarming rate. Why? Because people are selling silver to buy opium. Mountains of it. And the British smugglers are only too happy to accept silver in return. It's a perfect economic loop for Britain. For China, it's a hemorrhage. Here's the debate still burning among historians. Was this intentional economic warfare on Britain's part? A sinister, deliberate plan to destabilise China's economy? Or just imperial capitalism running wild, indifferent to consequences as long as the profits kept pouring in? There are arguments on both sides, but what can't be denied is the result. And you're starting to see the panic. The emperor's court tries to ban opium outright. It's already technically illegal, but now edicts are being issued with actual teeth. Punishments, inspections, surveillance. There's talk of military action, coastal crackdowns. You watch the bureaucracy mobilise slowly, reluctantly. It's like watching a tired man try to stop a river with his bare hands. You return south, and what do you see? The river's already bursting its banks. The volume of opium entering China explodes in just a few years, from a few thousand chests to tens of thousands. One historian compared the scale to modern drug trafficking, and it fits. Entire towns begin to depend on it economically. Local officials turn a blind eye or take their cut, and even those who resist find themselves powerless without support from Beijing. Now, let's talk numbers. By the 1830s, Britain is exporting over 30,000 chests of opium into China annually. Each chest holds roughly 40 pounds of the stuff. You do the math, it's an avalanche. A slow, smoky avalanche smothering a civilization that still believes it's immune. You wander through a provincial governor's estate. He's hosting a moon viewing party, lanterns glow, zithers hum softly. And yet, off to the side, half his staff are opium users, the governor himself. You catch a glimpse of a pipe being passed behind a screen. The drug has climbed to the very top. And still the emperor debates. Should we open our ports to better monitor trade? Should we negotiate directly with the British? Or should we fight? No one agrees, but one man is about to make that decision for them. He's already writing letters, drawing up plans, and steeling himself for the fight of his life. You don't know him yet, but his name is Lin Zexu, and he's about to set the empire on fire. You're back in Canton, standing at the edge of the Pearl River, watching boats cut through morning mist like blades. The sun gleams off jade-green water, but your attention is drawn to the smoke curling from the bustling streets. This isn't incense or cooking fires, it's opium. And it's everywhere. You can almost taste it in the humid air. A bittersweet tang that clings to your throat, making you cough and laugh at the same time. What started as a trickle is now a flood. The opium trade, smuggled in from India and eagerly consumed by merchants, soldiers, and even minor officials, has become a central artery of the local economy. You probably didn't expect to be tracing the roots of an empire's collapse through a haze of smoke, but here you are. The British merchants, smugly confident behind their high walls, sip their tea and tally their profits. Each chest of opium that leaves Bengal and lands on Chinese soil fills British coffers while draining China's silver reserves. You glance at one of the ledgers and shiver. It's a staggeringly simple equation. More opium equals more silver leaving China. Tea, silk, porcelain, and jade flow east. Silver flows west and opium flows back. It's not just trade. It's an economic weapon wrapped in smoke and euphoric haze. What you're seeing is one of the first truly globalized black markets, long before anyone coined the term. You wander through the narrow streets, dodging rickshaws and street hawkers selling dried fish, lotus roots, and yes, opium. People are lined up outside dens like children waiting for candy, their faces pale, their eyes distant. Some cough, others nod politely to acquaintances as they stagger through the humid morning air. Families are already feeling the effects. Farmers trade rice and grain for silver to buy opium. Children watch their parents weaken. Their elders grow feeble. Even small towns feel the pull of addiction, the societal weight pressing down like the oppressive summer heat. A quirky little fact hits you, as you duck into a side alley. Some Chinese scholars, in an effort to study opium's effects on the mind, are actually conducting what could be called early psychoactive experiments. They write detailed notes on a mood, perception, and reaction times after small doses, sometimes hosting informal symposiums in tea houses. It's all very secretive and admittedly very bizarre. Think academic conferences mixed with smoky dens. You can't help but wonder if curiosity about the human mind has ever caused this much chaos before. Back at the imperial court, the emperor, Dao Guang, who succeeded Jia Qing, is increasingly concerned. You sit through one of his council sessions, ministers argue, voices tight with frustration. Some insist on enforcing bans on opium, while others warn that aggressive action will provoke Britain, whose navy already looms menacingly across the seas. It's the first real moment when you sense that the Qing government is aware of the full scope of the problem, but awareness isn't action, and action isn't swift. One historian suggests that this delay reflects systemic bureaucratic inertia. Another argues it's sheer arrogance, an empire convinced of its cultural superiority, believing foreign merchants will comply with decrees as they always have. You feel the tension in the air like static before a storm. Meanwhile, the smugglers are adapting. You watch them in motion, small sampans weaving between larger trading ships, crates of opium transferred under cover of fog and darkness. They've even recruited locals disguised as monks or wandering merchants, making detection by officials almost impossible. The sophistication is alarming, and every chest that successfully lands reinforces the idea that this is no ordinary commodity. It's a tool of influence, an invisible army, quietly undermining authority. The debate among scholars rages quietly. Was the opium trade simply a symptom of a deeper imperial stagnation, or was it a deliberate economic attack by Britain? Some argue the trade was just one domino in a series of internal and external pressures, while others suggest the British recognised opium's addictive power and deliberately weaponized it against China. You watch and listen, realizing history itself can feel like a courtroom, with evidence everywhere and guilt impossible to assign. And here's the human element that hits hardest. Addiction isn't confined to the poor. You see mandarins, generals, and even some minor royals sampling opium in hidden chambers. Pipes pass through trembling fingers, smoke curling like ghostly serpents around jade tables. You start to sense the psychological and moral erosion that's quietly spreading through the empire, a corrosion far harder to fight than any army. The emperor's decrees might as well be whispers in the wind. On the streets there's a strange rhythm to daily life now. Market stalls, official edicts, and opium dens all exist in a kind of tense balance. You see merchants counting silver, labourers hauling goods, and families cautiously pacing around addicts. Every silver coin leaving the empire feels like a small betrayal. Every inhalation of smoke another notch in the quiet unraveling. Even as a bystander, you can feel the momentum, the tipping point is approaching. And here's the small, almost poetic fact. The Qing dynasty had survived natural disasters, peasant uprisings, and decades of bureaucratic stagnation before. But it had never faced a challenge like this. A foreign commodity disguised as trade, disguised further as luxury, slowly seeping into every level of society, reshaping the economy, the family, and the state itself. You can see it now. Opium isn't just a drug. It's a mirror reflecting weaknesses that no amount of lacquered gates or ceremonial robes can hide. By the mid-1820s, the opium trade has expanded to a level where you begin to realise that enforcement alone will never work. The empire is facing a compound problem. Addiction, economic hemorrhage, and moral panic all wrapped together. The stage is set for confrontation, and you feel the tension in your chest like a drumbeat. Something has to give, something will, and you, wandering the streets and corridors, are witnessing the calm before the storm, the moment when smoke first darkens the light of an empire at its height. You wander through the southern provinces, the air thick with humidity and the lingering scent of opium smoke, and realise you're witnessing something profoundly cultural, not just chemical. This is addiction as policy, sir. A quiet reshaping of society that touches every layer, from riverboat captains to Confucian scholars. In homes along the Pearl River, families hide their reliance on the trade while children watch parents' health deteriorate. Some women brew weak tea to mask the taste of opium, others add sugar or spices to make it more palatable for nervous guests. Even at court, whispers circulate that princes and mandarins indulge, often in secret chambers hidden behind screens of rosewood and silk. You can almost feel the moral fabric of the empire unraveling, stitch by stitch, smoke by smoke. Meanwhile, opium dens have grown both in number and sophistication. You duck into one, eyes adjusting to dim lantern light. The walls are carved with intricate floral patterns, faintly obscured by curling smoke. Patrons recline on velvet cushions, their bodies unnervingly still, their expressions slack, yet peaceful. Some hold books in their laps, others stare at nothing, lost in the haze. One eccentric patron insists that smoking opium enhances poetry, claiming he can read the clouds and feel the mountains through words. You nod politely, thinking he might be half right, though clearly deluded. This is the quiet theatre of addiction, where pleasure and decay dance together in slow motion. Economically, the situation is worse than you imagined. Silver is flowing out of China at an unprecedented rate. The government attempts to regulate trade, but enforcement is patchy. Officials are bribed or intimidated, coastal patrols are understaffed, and the sheer volume of smuggled opium overwhelms every effort at control. Every chest that makes it inland isn't just a shipment. It's a weapon eroding the foundations of governance. You can almost hear the faint drip of silver from coffers, a metallic echo of loss reverberating through the empire. By some estimates, tens of thousands of pounds of opium cross the southern ports annually, transforming both the economy and social norms. And here's the quirky twist. Some local communities adapt by ritualizing opium consumption, believing the smoke can ward off evil spirits or invite luck during harvests. You watch villagers pass around pipes during festivals, smoke spiraling toward the sky as if offering prayers. To a foreign observer, it seems absurd. To them, it's a melding of superstition and habit, a cultural rationalization for something that will ultimately devastate them. The combination of addiction, economy, and belief creates a feedback loop. The more people use, the more socially acceptable it becomes, and the harder it is for authorities to intervene effectively. Back in Beijing, Daoguang Emperor begins to take the problem seriously. You sit in council with him, noticing his hands clench and unclench. Advisors present reports. Silver is vanishing, opium use is rising, military readiness is declining, and social unrest is quietly growing. The emperor issues edicts, but each enforcement attempt is met with evasion, bribery, or outright defiance. Some officials advocate negotiation with the British, others insist on harsher punishments. You feel the tension in the air, the weight of responsibility pressing on every participant. The moral and political stakes are high, yet the solution seems perpetually just out of reach. It's in this climate that Lin Zexu begins to emerge. A man of extraordinary principle, you hear of him in whispers before ever meeting him. A scholar official known for incorruptibility, moral rigour, and an unusual willingness to confront foreign powers directly. He writes letters, gathers intelligence, and plans decisive action. You feel anticipation building. Someone finally seems willing to address the poison running through the veins of the empire. But even his boldness will face limitations, both practical and political, that hint at the challenges to come. Opium doesn't just affect the economy and politics, it reshapes daily life. You observe families altering meal patterns to accommodate smoking schedules, children learning to hide their father's addiction, and soldiers stationed near ports appearing lethargic or disoriented. The entire social rhythm bends around the habit. What was once an isolated vice has become infrastructure, silently entwined with commerce, governance, and family. You begin to see how subtle yet devastating this influence is, how it erodes the state not through a single battle, but through decades of quiet, insidious change. And here's a lingering scholarly debate. Some historians argue the Qing dynasty could have turned the tide if officials had acted decisively in the 1820s, enforcing bans and cutting off smuggling at its source. Others contend that global trade pressures and local dependence made such a move impossible. The question remains, was opium the root cause of decline, or merely the accelerant of an empire already weakened by internal and external forces? You feel the uncertainty tug at the narrative, a reminder that history is rarely straightforward. By the late 1820s, opium is not a marginal problem, it is a national crisis. You sense the first real cracks in social cohesion, a tremor beneath the gilded surface of imperial power. Families, officials, merchants, and soldiers all participate willingly or unwillingly in the cycle of consumption and profit. And yet, despite the mounting evidence of danger, the empire hesitates. Policies are reactive, half-hearted, and inconsistent. You can almost hear the distant echo of disaster. an impending collision between addiction, trade and sovereignty that will shake China to its core. The stage is set for confrontation. You wandering through smoke-filled alleys and marble corridors see it everywhere. The slow corrosion of trust, authority and health. Opium is no longer a commodity. It is a force shaping society, policy and destiny. The empire is moving toward a reckoning, and even from the shadows you can sense the coming storm, the clash that will define not just the Qing dynasty but China itself. Every puff of smoke carries a warning. Every chest of silver lost whispers of an empire in peril. You take a deep breath of the humid southern air and feel history pressing against your chest like a weight too heavy to ignore. You find yourself inside the grand halls of the Forbidden City, where the Daoguang Emperor paces behind latticed screens, visibly frustrated. The court is alive with tension, a stark contrast to the serene opulence of chandeliers, lacquered panels, and dragon motifs that once masked anxiety. Reports flood in from the southern provinces, silver disappearing at alarming rates, opium dens proliferating faster than officials can close them, and social unrest simmering beneath the surface. You sense the emperor's growing unease, not just as a ruler, but as a man realizing that the empire's stability is slipping like sand through his fingers. He has been warned repeatedly, but the scale of the problem is now undeniable. The cracks are visible to anyone willing to look closely. The emperor's ministers present conflicting solutions. Some advocate negotiation with Britain, hoping diplomacy can restrain the influx of opium and recover lost silver. Others call for strict enforcement, harsher penalties and coastal patrols. You watch the tension in the council room. Scholars and officials argue with controlled urgency, aware that any misstep could provoke foreign retaliation or domestic revolt. Daoguang nods and frowns, weighing the options, knowing that each carries significant risk. The empire's bureaucracy, once a source of pride, now feels cumbersome and slow, struggling to match the nimbleness of foreign merchants. Meanwhile, Lin Zexu has begun to earn a reputation in the southern provinces. You hear stories of him inspecting ports personally, confronting smugglers and demanding loyalty from local officials. His commitment is relentless. He orders confiscations of opium, instructs soldiers to enforce bans, and writes letters to British merchants warning of severe consequences for continued trafficking. You sense his determination. This is no mere bureaucratic exercise, but a more moral crusade. Lin believes the empire's survival depends on stopping the trade and the addiction it fosters. His resolve stands out sharply against the indecision that permeates the court. You walk through the streets of Canton, noticing subtle shifts in daily life. Merchants grow cautious, aware that inspectors might appear at any moment. Opium dens are quieter, their doors partially shuttered. Smokers now exchange wary glances with one another, conscious that the moral tide may be turning. Families whisper warnings about addiction, and even some users begin to hide their habit more carefully. Lin Zexu's influence has sparked hope, but also panic. Enforcement is uneven, and resistance among local officials is subtle yet persistent. You feel the tension, like walking a tightrope between justice and chaos. The economic picture is alarming. Silver, the lifeblood of China's foreign trade, continues to flow outward. Every chest of opium successfully smuggled converts Chinese wealth into British profit. Markets that once thrived on tea, silk and porcelain now revolve increasingly around opium transactions. Farmers who once cultivated rice or cotton shift to silver-backed opium sales to survive. You notice the subtle changes in social structure. Rural communities dependent on this trade, officials complicit in smuggling, and urban centres dominated by addiction. The empire's economy is straining under the dual weight of moral decay and financial hemorrhage. And here's your fringe fact for the night. Some opium users believe that the smoke could enhance spiritual meditation, allowing them to communicate with ancestors or divine spirits. It's a curious adaptation, blending superstition with vice, a coping mechanism that turns personal addiction into perceived ritual. You pause and imagine sitting in one of those dens, watching smoke curl like ethereal threads, while people claim visions of past dynasties or mystical insights. The cultural adaptation is eerie, yet it also highlights how deeply opium is infiltrating the psyche of society. Historians continue to debate whether the Qing dynasty could have acted sooner. Some argue that a decisive, coordinated campaign against smuggling in the 1820s might have curtailed the opium problem before it reached catastrophic proportions. Others counter that systemic corruption, local economic dependence, and Britain's naval power made early intervention effectively impossible. You feel the weight of this debate pressing down, understanding that the empire's failure was not just moral but structural, a combination of complacency, miscalculation, and circumstance. Despite growing awareness, resistance within the court hampers effective action. Some ministers fear that aggressive enforcement could spark open conflict with Britain, while others underestimate the scale of addiction sweeping through cities and provinces alike. You notice the subtle signs of panic: hurried edicts by ambushes, frantic letters sent to provincial governors, and whispered reports of smugglers evading capture. The sense of urgency is palpable, yet the measures remain reactive, piecemeal, and insufficient. You feel the tension as a physical force, pressing against walls and echoing through the corridors like a drumbeat of inevitability. On the streets, the social impact is unmistakable. Families grapple with addiction quietly, often compensating with reduced consumption of essentials or borrowing silver to buy more opium. Children witness their parents' decline, learning to navigate a world where vice and survival are entwined. Soldiers stationed near ports are sluggish, often reporting late or failing to enforce patrols effectively. You sense the erosion of discipline and authority, subtle but cumulative, like a tide gradually wearing away stone cliffs. The empire's outward grandeur masks an internal vulnerability that grows more acute every day. As Lin Zexu's campaign gains momentum, you begin to feel the narrative shifting. Smugglers are caught, opium is seized and destroyed, and moral authority is asserted with unusual vigour. But even as victories accumulate, the underlying forces, British trade interests, local complicity, and widespread addiction, remain formidable. You realise that Lin's efforts, heroic as they are a prelude to larger confrontations. The problem is now national, international, and deeply embedded in the social fabric. You can feel the tension coiling like a spring ready to snap, hinting at the conflicts that will soon define the empire's trajectory. By the mid-1830s, it's clear that China is at a crossroads. The opium crisis has revealed vulnerabilities at every level: economic, social, moral, and political. Enforcement efforts highlight both bravery and the limitations of imperial power. You sense that the empire's fate is no longer controlled solely by its rulers. External pressures and internal decay have joined forces in a slow, inexorable dance. Walking through palace halls or bustling streets, you feel the weight of history pressing down, tangible and inexorable, as if the empire itself knows its days of unchallenged grandeur are numbered. You're standing on the southern coast watching waves slap against the hulls of ships anchored in Canton harbour, and suddenly it hits you. This isn't just a trade dispute. This is a moral confrontation with consequences rippling through the entire empire. Lin Zexu, now firmly in charge of enforcing the opium bans, moves like a whirlwind through the city. You watch him inspect warehouses, interrogate smugglers, and issue proclamations with a voice that brooks no argument. The air hums with a strange mixture of fear, respect, and excitement. The locals whisper his name as though he were a guardian spirit, or perhaps a storm, depending on their perspective. Either way, he has arrived to draw a line in the sand, and you're about to see what happens when bureaucracy meets moral courage. The scale of Lin's operation is staggering. Tens of thousands of chests of opium are seized in a coordinated effort that seems almost cinematic in scope. You wander alongside him as he oversees the destruction of these stocks, watching the dense, pungent smoke curl into the humid air. Chests are broken open, the golden brown resin poured into pits, and then set ablaze. The smell is sharp and acrid, stinging your eyes and throat. You realise that the act is not just symbolic, it is a declaration of sovereignty. For the first time, China is openly challenging British merchants, asserting that foreign profit will not dictate domestic policy. The drama of it is intoxicating, but beneath the spectacle lies a dangerous reality. The British Empire will not ignore such an affront. In one warehouse, you see the human cost of the trade writ large. Smugglers are rounded up, some shaking, some defiant. Lin interrogates them with unyielding intensity, demanding names, routes, and accomplices. You sense the tension thickening. The smugglers are not just breaking local law. They are operating within a global network backed by one of the world's most powerful empires. Punishments are harsh: confiscation, public shaming, even exile for the most egregious offenders. And yet, for all the immediate triumph, you feel the underlying challenge looming. The problem is far bigger than Canton, far bigger than even Lin Zexu himself. The river of opium is vast, and the empire's reach is limited. There's a quirky historical aside. During these confiscations, some smugglers attempted to bribe officials with opium disguised as medicinal herbs or even sweet treats. One particularly audacious merchant claimed his chests contained dragon tea, leading to a brief and absurd inspection before Lin's team saw through the ruse. You can't help but picture the scene, the officials frowning, sniffing, poking and finally dumping entire chests into the fire, while the merchant watches, horrified. The moment captures the combination of ingenuity, desperation and absurdity that pervades this crisis. The British reaction is swift. You hear the cannon fire and gunboats moving downriver, a tangible reminder that economic interests and naval power will defend the trade. Diplomats arrive to demand compensation, while merchants threaten retaliation. You feel the tension as history teeters on the edge of open conflict. Lin Zexu, aware of the danger, remains unflinching. His moral clarity is a stark contrast to the empire's previously hesitant approach. He writes letters to Queen Victoria herself, warning of consequences should the trade continue, though the effectiveness of such diplomacy is hotly debated. Some scholars argue these letters were largely symbolic, a gesture of moral authority. Others contend they were a calculated attempt to avert war. Meanwhile, the social impact intensifies. Locals who once relied on opium for livelihood now face uncertainty. Families worried about addiction now confront economic instability as smuggling routes collapse. You walk through Canton streets and see merchants calculating losses, labourers fretting over wages, and entire neighbourhoods abuzz with rumours. The sudden enforcement disrupts both commerce and culture, revealing just how deeply the trade had been woven into daily life. You realise that moral intervention comes with enormous collateral consequences. The debate among historians remains vivid. Was Lin Zexu's uncompromising approach heroic and necessary, or did it provoke a conflict that the Qing dynasty was ultimately unprepared to manage? Some argue that his actions, while morally righteous, directly triggered the First Opium War. Others insist that inaction would have allowed Britain to dominate China economically and socially for decades longer. You feel the weight of these arguments pressing down on the story like the humid southern air, thick with smoke and tension. By the time Lin completes the opium destruction, the scale of defiance is evident. Tens of thousands of chests burned, countless smugglers apprehended, and a city electrified by moral certainty, but also on the brink of retaliation. You sense the quiet before the storm, an empire asserting itself, yet aware that its assertion may provoke the mightiest naval power in the world. The drama is palpable, the stakes immense. Every wisp of smoke, every silver coin lost, every chest destroyed is part of a narrative that will soon escalate beyond imagination. You step back and take in the scene, the fire, the smoke, the apprehensive onlookers, and Lin Zexu himself, resolute and uncompromising. This is history at its most vivid, chaotic, and morally charged. You feel the tension crackle through the air like electricity, knowing that these actions, as courageous as they are, will soon intersect with international power, diplomacy, and war. The empire has drawn its line, but you understand instinctively that drawing a line is only the beginning of the story. The opium tide is not so easily contained, and the coming conflict will forever alter the trajectory of China. You stand on the banks of the Pearl River, watching the first British gunboats cut through the morning mist, and feel a chill creep up your spine. This is no longer a matter of smugglers or local enforcement. It's the thunder of empire meeting empire. Britain, incensed by the destruction of thousands of chests of opium, responds with naval force. You watch sailors hoist cannons onto decks, their polished wood gleaming, the iron roaring in anticipation. The First Opium War has begun. You can almost hear the whispering tension in Canton, a city caught between moral action and military might, each cannon shot echoing the clash between ambition, addiction and sovereignty. The Qing forces, mostly lightly armed and unprepared for modern naval combat, scramble to respond. You follow local militia as they attempt to fortify the coastline, constructing makeshift batteries and signalling towers. The scale of the British assault is breathtaking. Steam-powered warships with long-range cannons, disciplined crews, and strategic coordination unlike anything the Qing have encountered. You feel the tension in the salt-sweet air, the pulse of history quickening. China's greatest empire, so vast and proud, faces an enemy whose strength is both technological and global. The disparity is immediate and shocking. On shore, the social consequences are immediate. Civilians flee to narrow alleys, markets close, and opium dens shutter their doors in anticipation of conflict. Merchants weigh losses against loyalty, labourers calculate risk versus pay, and families brace for violence that may sweep through even the most distant corners of the city. You notice a strange dissonance. The moral high ground of Lin Zexu's campaign contrasts sharply with the very tangible fear of cannon fire and naval bombardment. Enforcement and morality collide with the harsh calculus of war, revealing the vulnerability of even the most disciplined imperial structure. There's a quirky historical detail that catches your eye. Some British sailors, unfamiliar with Chinese terrain, relied on local guides who secretly resented foreign intervention. In several skirmishes, these guides misled British troops, resulting in comically wrong detours that nevertheless did not prevent eventual victory. You smile at the absurdity, realizing that even in war, human error and cultural misunderstanding add layers of unpredictability. It's a reminder that history is rarely clean, rarely straightforward, and always a mix of strategy, luck, and human folly. Diplomatic channels are stretched to their limits. You sit in court as envoys present increasingly urgent letters, compensation for destroyed opium, demands for trade concessions, threats of full-scale blockade. The emperor and his ministers argue passionately over strategy. Should they negotiate to avoid bloodshed or resist at all costs? You feel the moral weight pressing against the opulent walls of the Forbidden City, the glittering dragons and golden motifs suddenly feeling fragile, almost ornamental, in the face of industrialized military power. The economic impact is immediate and severe. Ports are blockaded, silver flows slow, and local economies dependent on trade, both legal and illicit, begin to contract. Farmers who had shifted to opium cultivation watch their incomes plummet. Merchants with destroyed warehouses tally losses, and officials face unprecedented pressure to maintain stability amid chaos. You sense the fragility of an empire that had relied on centuries of bureaucracy and ritualized governance to manage societal challenges. Confronted with a technologically superior foreign power, the Qing system strains at its seams. Scholarly debates over the First Opium War persist to this day. Was it inevitable given the economic pressures and moral standoff, or could diplomacy have prevented the clash? Some argue that Britain's industrial and naval superiority made conflict unavoidable, while others contend that a more flexible Qing approach might have delayed, if not prevented, full-scale war. You feel the tension of this debate as you walk along the riverbank, imagining the collision of gunpowder ideology and global commerce that historians still dissect centuries later. Amid the chaos, Lin Zexu remains a figure of moral clarity. You follow him as he coordinates defences, drafts proclamations, and attempts to maintain public order. His presence reassures some, angers others, and fascinates all. You realise that even with courage and principle, individual action is constrained by systemic weaknesses, corruption, logistical limitations, and the sheer scale of the empire. The juxtaposition of heroic initiative against structural vulnerability is stark, almost cinematic. By the summer of 1839, Canton is effectively a war zone. Cannons thunder, smoke mingles with the tropical humidity, and everyday life is suspended. You walk the streets and feel the tension like a living organism pulsing through the alleys and markets. Every family, merchant, and official becomes a participant in history, whether willingly or not. The opium crisis has transformed from moral and economic challenge into military confrontation, and the trajectory of the Qing dynasty is forever altered. The stage is set for treaties, losses, and humiliations that will echo for decades. And here's the haunting part. You notice that even as cannons roar and warships maneuver, the opium trade hasn't stopped entirely. Some smugglers exploit chaos, some users continue in secret, and some officials turn a blind eye. The empire is fighting on multiple fronts: military, moral, economic, and the complexity of each battle ensures that none can be fully won. You understand that the First Opium War is only the opening chapter of a much larger story, one in which smoke, silver, and sovereignty collide in ways that will reshape China's destiny forever. You stand on the deck of a Qing patrol boat watching Canton harbour transform into a battlefield, and the enormity of what has just happened hits you. The Treaty of Nanking has been signed, and with it comes a reality that shakes the foundations of the empire. China has ceded Hong Kong to Britain, agreed to pay massive indemnities and opened 5 treaty ports to foreign trade. You feel a mix of awe and disbelief. The empire that once believed itself the Middle Kingdom has been forced to negotiate under terms dictated by a foreign power. You can almost hear the echoes of imperial confidence cracking against the hard edge of reality. This is not a minor setback. This is a redefinition of sovereignty. Walking through the bustling streets of the newly opened treaty ports, you notice the subtle changes immediately. Foreign merchants set up shops, displaying goods previously unavailable in China. British, American, and even French traders roam freely, their movements no longer constrained by rigid Chinese regulations. You sense a shift in cultural and economic gravity. The empire's control over commerce and, by extension, society, is eroding. Local officials struggle to adjust, some resentful, some bribed, and some simply overwhelmed. You feel the quiet humiliation in the air, the sense that centuries of carefully structured power have been disrupted with a single stroke of diplomacy backed by military might. The opium problem, of course, has not disappeared. Smugglers exploit the new treaty ports, using legal trade channels as cover for continued trafficking. Silver continues to flow westward, enriching foreign merchants while destabilizing local economies. You observe families in port towns adjusting once again to a reality in which foreign influence is unavoidable, opium trade persists, and the moral high ground feels increasingly unattainable. What once seemed like an isolated coastal problem has now become systemic, a structural issue amplified by the empire's concessions. Here's the quirky historical detail. Some British officials in the treaty ports took the opportunity to host elaborate parties, complete with opium-smoking lounges designed to impress visiting Chinese dignitaries. The irony is thick. You watch local officials navigating diplomacy while inhaling the very substance their government had fought so hard to suppress. It's absurd, almost theatrical, and underscores the surreal blend of commerce, addiction, and power that defines this moment in history. At court, Daoguang Emperor and his advisors struggle to absorb the reality. The loss of Hong Kong is symbolic and practical, but the indemnities are crushing. You sit in council and hear figures thrown about that make your head spin. Millions of silver dollars, reparations that will burden the treasury for decades. Meanwhile, the treaty's provisions for foreign residents and trade in previously restricted cities represent a profound shift in control. You feel the tension in the room, the mixture of disbelief, anger, and helplessness, as the empire confronts a future dictated in part by foreigners whose interests are indifferent to Chinese tradition or morality. The social impact is equally dramatic. Families living near treaty ports must adapt to new commercial patterns, foreign currencies, and unfamiliar laws. Merchants navigate relationships with foreigners, some profitably, some disastrously. Labourers see opportunities but also risks as foreign trade transforms local economies. You walk through the streets and sense the subtle cultural shock. Western architecture rising among traditional Chinese structures, foreign goods displayed boldly in markets, and new customs seeping into daily life. Even the most rigid social hierarchies begin to feel porous, challenged by the commerce, coercion, and cultural exchange. Scholars debate the Treaty of Nanking endlessly. Some argue it represents the first clear evidence of the century of humiliation, a turning point when China's global position began to erode irrevocably. Others insist it was merely a temporary setback, one that could have been rectified with stronger military, diplomatic, and administrative reforms. You feel the tension of this debate in the atmosphere around you. One moment, history is a sequence of battles and treaties of war. The next, it is a lens through which entire nations re-examine identity, sovereignty, and pride. Economically, the treaty opens the door for foreign influence, but also entrenches systemic weaknesses. You notice that the Qing government now collects customs duties under foreign supervision, undermining traditional fiscal authority. Silver continues to flow outward, while local industries struggle to compete with imported goods. Farmers, once dependent on subsistence crops, face new pressures from global markets and opium cultivation. You see that the empire's internal cohesion, already stressed by addiction and bureaucracy, now faces external pressures it cannot easily resist. Culturally, the loss of control over trade and territory produces both anxiety and adaptation. You see families attempting to preserve tradition, even as foreign goods infiltrate markets, towns, and habits. Some Chinese intellectuals view these changes as catastrophic, others as opportunities for modernization. You sense that this tension between preservation and adaptation will define intellectual and political debates for decades. Opium, trade, and foreign influence are now intertwined threads, reshaping not only economy and governance, but the very identity of the Qing dynasty. By the time you leave Canton, the reality is inescapable. The empire has survived battles, rebellions, and natural disasters, yet this treaty represents a strategic and psychological blow from which recovery will be extraordinarily difficult. The opium trade continues, foreign influence is entrenched, and internal reforms remain sluggish. You feel the weight of inevitability, the sense that history is accelerating in ways both tragic and fascinating. The Treaty of Nanking is not just a document. It is a turning point, signalling a new era in which China must navigate forces both internal and external, moral and material, that will challenge the very essence of empire. You're back on the southern coast, months after the Treaty of Nanking, and the uneasy calm feels almost surreal. The British have retreated to their posts, guns silenced for the moment, but the consequences of war linger everywhere. Trade continues, but under new rules. Foreign merchants now move with unprecedented freedom, and the Qing administration struggles to regulate an economy it can no longer fully control. You walk along the riverfront, observing merchants adjusting ledgers, sailors unloading goods, and local families negotiating a fragile new reality where commerce, addiction, and foreign influence intersect in ways the empire was ill-prepared to manage. The landscape feels familiar yet subtly altered, as if the city itself is adjusting to an invisible tectonic shift. Meanwhile, the opium problem surges back with renewed force. Smugglers exploit the treaty ports as conduits for their trade, capitalizing on legal loopholes and local complicity. You notice merchants discreetly exchanging chests under lantern light, avoiding the scrutiny of inspectors, and you feel a sense of inevitability. No amount of legislation or moral enforcement can fully stop the flow. Families, already economically entangled in the trade, adapt further, some reluctantly participating, others coerced by circumstance. Addiction persists, now both a private tragedy and a public challenge. You can almost see the invisible network stretching across rivers, ports, and villages, connecting commerce and vice like veins through the body of the empire. Back at court, the Daoguang Emperor and his advisors face mounting frustration. You sit through debates where officials argue about the impossibility of total enforcement and the necessity of compromise. Some propose legalizing opium for taxation purposes, reasoning that controlled trade may reduce clandestine smuggling while providing much-needed revenue. Others insist that any legalization undermines morality and imperial authority. You feel the tension in the air as bureaucracy, ethics, and practicality collide. The empire is caught in a dilemma, the desire to assert sovereignty versus the economic and social realities that make full enforcement almost impossible. A quirky detail stands out during these deliberations. Some officials begin conducting scientific experiments with opium to determine safe consumption levels, believing that controlled use could mitigate social damage. You chuckle privately at the absurdity of treating a highly addictive substance like a harmless tea, yet you understand the desperation driving such reasoning. It highlights both the ingenuity and the contradictions of the Qing administration, a government grappling with moral responsibility and practical necessity under unprecedented external pressure. The British, aware of the Qing's struggles, exploit these weaknesses skillfully. You witness envoys and traders leveraging both diplomacy and subtle intimidation to expand influence, extracting concessions while maintaining an appearance of propriety. Trade balances shift further, silver continues to flow outward, and local economies become increasingly dependent on imported goods and opium revenue. You feel the creeping realization that the empire's authority is being eroded not solely through direct conquest, but through structural and economic manipulation that operates beneath the surface of traditional governance. Socially, the impact is pervasive. You walk through towns where families adapt daily routines around opium consumption, children observe parental decline, and local labour practices are dictated by smuggling and enforcement schedules. Soldiers tasked with maintaining order are frequently compromised by addiction, further weakening imperial authority. The subtle but relentless erosion of discipline, health, and economic stability illustrates how deeply opium has penetrated every layer of society. It is no longer merely a drug problem, it is a structural problem with moral, political, and cultural dimensions. Historians debate whether the post-treaty surge in opium was predictable or inevitable. Some argue that the British used the treaty as an opportunity to entrench dependence deliberately, exploiting the empire's weakened bargaining position. Others contend that social and economic inertia made the resurgence unavoidable. Once local networks, labour patterns and cultural habits had adapted to opium trade, suppression became nearly impossible. You feel the tension in this debate, understanding that historical causality is rarely linear, and that a single treaty can cascade into consequences far beyond what its drafters imagined. At the provincial level, local enforcement is inconsistent. You observe magistrates attempting to control the flow, sometimes with success, often with failure. Smugglers exploit gaps in oversight, bribing officials or rerouting shipments through newly opened ports. The complexity of policing an empire the size of China, with a bureaucracy already stretched thin and corruption endemic, becomes painfully apparent. You realise that even heroic figures like Lin Zexu cannot fully contain a crisis of this magnitude. Individual virtue collides with systemic vulnerability, producing outcomes that are both tragic and unavoidable. Economically, the continued opium trade deepens dependency. You notice that regions previously self-sufficient now rely heavily on cash flows tied to opium transactions. Farmers grow poppy instead of grain. Merchants profit from smuggling. Soldiers accept bribes to look the other way. You feel the interlocking nature of addiction, commerce, and governance. A self-reinforcing cycle that strengthens the trade's resilience while weakening the empire. The problem is no longer localized. It is embedded in the social, economic, and political fabric. By the early 1840s, you sense that the stage is set for further confrontation. Canton and other southern cities simmer with tension. Social norms are destabilized, and imperial authority struggles to assert itself against both internal compromise and external pressure. The First Opium War may have ended with a treaty, but the underlying crisis persists, setting the stage for renewed conflict. You walk through the humid streets, inhale the faint tang of opium smoke, and feel the pulse of history quicken. This is not an endpoint. It is a prelude, a warning that the empire's greatest challenges are still unfolding. You watch from the outskirts of Beijing as news spreads of foreign troops advancing southward and the summer palace being set ablaze, and the scale of loss finally sinks in. The grandeur of imperial power, once untouchable, has been punctured by cannon fire, greed, and miscalculation. You wander through the charred remains of pavilions, marble staircases now cracked and blackened, golden roofs are reduced to smouldering ash. The air smells of scorched wood, incense, and something heavier, the faint metallic tang of inevitability. This destruction is both literal and symbolic, a message that no empire, no matter how mighty in culture or tradition, is immune to the collision of modern military force and global commerce. Inside the city, the court reels from the humiliation. The Daoguang emperor meets with ministers in tense chambers, the walls echoing with the weight of a dynasty suddenly feeling small. You sit through deliberations where officials weigh the impossibility of countering technologically superior Western forces with outdated armaments and strategies. Some argue for accommodation and appeasement, hoping that paying reparations and opening more ports might stave off further disaster. Others demand retaliation, though everyone knows the Qing military is outmatched. You feel the sense of helplessness pressing like a physical force. History has shifted, and the dynasty's old certainties no longer hold. Socially, the impact ripples across communities. Refugees from war-torn southern cities arrive in northern provinces, carrying stories of burning ports, devastated families and disrupted trade. You see merchants struggling to rebuild inventories, labourers grappling with scarcity, and officials attempting to enforce laws under impossible conditions. Even opium dens, once discreet, become chaotic hubs as displaced populations seek escape and solace in smoke. The lines between moral crisis, economic collapse, and human suffering blur, leaving you with the unmistakable impression that the empire is unraveling from multiple fronts at once. A quirky historical detail emerges amidst the devastation. Some looters, unable to resist irony, collect remnants of destroyed Western buildings and incorporate them into small shrines, claiming that the materials carry foreign spirits to ward off future attacks. You pause and imagine these tiny, absurd rituals in back alleys or village courtyards, a blend of superstition, resourcefulness, and defiance. It is simultaneously tragic and darkly humorous, a human attempt to impose meaning on a world spinning faster than any one person, or empire, can control. Economically, the destruction deepens systemic vulnerabilities. The looting and burning of trade centres disrupt supply chains for both domestic goods and foreign imports. Silver reserves continue to hemorrhage outward to cover reparations and compensate foreign merchants. Local economies, already stressed by opium dependence, now buckle under additional strain. You watch small towns adapt in creative, often desperate yet digital ways. Farmers revert to subsistence crops, black markets flourish, and officials accept bribes to keep peace. The empire's economic backbone, once resilient and self-contained, bends under combined pressure from addiction, war, and foreign influence. Historians still debate the significance of the Summer Palace's destruction. Some view it as purely punitive, a British message to demonstrate the consequences of moral and economic defiance. Others interpret it as a symbolic severing of China's historical continuity, a psychological blow designed to destabilise morale. You sense the truth lies somewhere in between. The empire suffers both materially and spiritually, leaving scars that will echo for generations. You feel that same scar, faint but tangible, as you walk through ruined gardens, imagining the emperors and courtiers who once strolled these paths, oblivious to the war and storm approaching. Diplomatic fallout adds another layer of complexity. Envoys, treaties and indemnities flood in from Western powers, demanding ever more concessions. You overhear discussions about port rights, trade privileges and legal exemptions for foreigners. Each negotiation chips away at the Qing dynasty's autonomy, embedding foreign influence in ways both formal and informal. You feel a tension in the air, a creeping sense that sovereignty, once assumed absolute, is now contingent on foreign approval and naval might. At the provincial level, the effects are immediate and destabilizing. You see local officials scrambling to manage refugee flows, enforce partial laws, and maintain social order. Families are fractured, communities reorganized, and local economies are forced to adapt rapidly to shortages, opium dependence, and the presence of foreign trade. Soldiers tasked with protection often lack discipline, or are distracted by addiction, weakening security further. You begin to understand how quickly an empire's strength can be eroded when internal decay meets external force. Culturally, the psychological impact is profound. You observe citizens grappling with humiliation, fear, and uncertainty, while simultaneously trying to maintain rituals, festivals, and social norms. The opium trade, which had once seemed a peripheral vice, now intertwines with daily survival, commerce, and identity. You sense a subtle but persistent tension between adaptation and resistance, between the desire to maintain tradition and the need to navigate a radically altered world. Every smoke-filled alley, every ruined palace hall, and every whispered report of foreign negotiation reminds you that China's grandeur has been shaken in ways that will persist far beyond the immediate conflict. By the end of the summer, the full weight of the disaster is apparent. The First Opium War may have concluded with treaties, but the human, cultural and economic tolls resonate throughout the boundary of the empire. You walk through Beijing, past courtyards once alive with ceremony, and now tinged with fear and uncertainty, and feel the full gravity of historical change. The opium crisis has moved from trade to moral challenge to military confrontation, leaving an empire struggling to reconcile past glory with present vulnerability. You realise that the events unfolding now are not isolated. They are the beginning of a series of upheavals that will define the Qing dynasty's final decades. You step into the chaos of the Taiping Rebellion, and the scale of internal upheaval becomes staggering. The Opium Wars may have opened China to foreign influence, but now the empire faces a threat from within, a civil war that will rival any external conflict in its destructiveness. You walk through villages, where banners bearing the symbol of the heavenly kingdom of great peace flutter in the wind, proclaiming a vision of radical reform. Peasants, inspired by religious fervour and a desire to escape both poverty and imperial corruption, take up arms in massive numbers. You feel the tension in the air like static, an empire simultaneously hemorrhaging economically and fracturing socially, as smoke from opium dens mingles with the dust of marching armies. The movement is as much ideological as military. You observe followers of Hong Xiuquan, the self-proclaimed brother of Jesus, preaching a mix of Christian doctrine and anti-Qing sentiment. Their goal is nothing less than the total overhaul of Chinese society. You watch them establish quasi-governments in captured towns, imposing new rules on taxation, morality and social organisation. Opium use is often prohibited in these areas, a fascinating paradox. While opium had weakened the empire, its prohibition becomes a rallying point for rebellion. You sense a grim irony. The very substance that undermined imperial authority is now used as a moral justification for revolutionary zeal. Socially, the rebellion is devastating. Villages caught between Qing forces and Taiping armies experience displacement, famine, and disease. You witness entire communities uprooted, families separated, and traditional hierarchies upended. Soldiers, once bogged down by addiction and inefficiency, are forced into brutal campaigns that leave towns in ruins. Markets collapse, crops fail, and refugees flood into neighbouring provinces. You feel the psychological weight of the rebellion, the sense of living through a society unraveling, where law, tradition, and security are all in flux. Economically, the Taiping Rebellion compounds the damage already inflicted by opium and foreign treaties. Agricultural production plummets in rebel-held territories, reducing tax revenue and destabilising the imperial economy further. Merchants are forced to flee or pay tribute to occupying forces, and long-standing trade networks are disrupted. You see the cascading effects. Cities that once thrived on commerce now rely on emergency grain shipments, local economies fragment, and the treasury strains to support military campaigns. The empire's fiscal health, already weakened by indemnities to foreign powers, is now in critical condition. A quirky detail emerges in the midst of this turmoil. Some Taiping leaders experimented with collective kitchens and communal living arrangements, intending to create utopian micro-societies within rebel territory. You watch peasants adapt to these experiments with a mixture of hope and suspicion. It is both idealistic and chaotic, a microcosm of the broader rebellion, full of human ingenuity and desperate improvisation, yet deeply unstable and prone to collapse under pressure. At the court in Beijing, Daoguang Emperor and his ministers struggle to coordinate responses. You sit in council rooms filled with maps, reports and dispatches from the provinces. Discussions revolve around troop deployments, fortifications and negotiations with regional governors, many of whom are reluctant or corrupt. You feel the tension of the court acutely, the sense that central authority is overstretched, morally exhausted, and grappling with threats both external and internal. Every decision carries weighty consequences, and indecision can mean catastrophe. Historians debate the connection between the opium crisis and the Taiping Rebellion. Some argue that the social disruption, economic strain, and moral erosion caused by widespread addiction contributed directly to the rebellion's emergence. Others contend that deep-seated regional inequalities, religious fervour, and Qing administrative failures were more decisive. You feel the ambiguity pressing in. History rarely offers simple cause and effect narratives, and here, multiple forces collide to produce chaos. In rural areas, you notice an unsettling rhythm. Villages attempting to maintain normalcy amid rebellion and opium dependence. Families hedge their bets, cultivating both food and cash crops, while quietly negotiating with local Taiping commanders. Soldiers enforce laws inconsistently, and opium dens either close or operate under new rules. You sense the resilience and fragility of ordinary people, caught between competing powers and moral frameworks. Their survival strategies are inventive, yet the cost is immense, both socially and psychologically. By the mid-1850s, it is clear that the Taiping Rebellion will reshape the empire fundamentally. The conflict, intertwined with the lingering effects of opium and foreign treaties, threatens to collapse long-standing structures of governance, economy and society. You walk through smouldering towns, dusty battlefields and crowded refugee settlements, and the enormity of the challenge facing the Qing becomes palpable. It is no longer merely a struggle against addiction or foreign intrusion. It is a war for the very soul and structure of China. Even amid devastation, the cultural implications are striking. Rebel-held areas experiment with literacy programs, alternative governance and moral codes that reject both opium and traditional Qing hierarchies. You see a society attempting to reinvent itself under extreme pressure, combining idealism with survival instincts. Yet the paradox is unavoidable. While these reforms promise renewal, the violence, displacement, and social upheaval they accompany ensure profound human suffering. The empire is caught between decay and reinvention, and you can feel the tension of that moment vibrating in every ruined village and battle-scarred province. You wander through the rural heartlands and notice the slow erosion of China's agricultural backbone, and it hits you just how much opium has reshaped everyday life. Farmers who once cultivated rice, wheat and cotton now devote vast swaths of land to poppies, lured by silver and coerced by the local market demands. Fields shimmer in the late afternoon sun with the red-orange hue of opium flowers, deceptively beautiful yet emblematic of social decay. Families struggle to balance subsistence farming with the production of a crop that sustains addiction and fuels local economies. You realise that opium isn't just a moral or legal issue. It's a structural problem embedded in the very soil of the empire. As you pass through villages, you notice the human cost in real time. Parents appear gaunt, eyes dulled and labourers slow, their strength sapped by daily consumption. Children grow up under the shadow of addiction, learning to navigate a world where vice, economy and family survival are tangled. Small communities develop coping mechanisms, rotating responsibilities, secret storage of essential foods, or informal rules about opium use to prevent complete collapse. You feel the weight of everyday decisions, each one a precarious balance between maintaining life and succumbing to dependency. Even a single misstep can ripple outward, destabilizing not just one household, but entire networks of trade and labour. At the provincial level, governance begins to falter. You witness magistrates struggling to collect taxes while managing both opium enforcement and local rebellions. Some officials accept bribes, rationalising that they are merely keeping order. Others attempt enforcement but face resistance from both smugglers and addicted populations. Soldiers, already weakened by a prior exposure to opium, patrol sluggishly or desert altogether. You sense the erosion of state authority as a tangible force, visible in empty guard posts, delayed orders, and whispered complaints among officials. The empire, once a monolith of centralised control, feels like a collection of fragile, loosely bound networks barely holding together. Economically, the situation is disastrous. Opium has drained silver reserves for decades, and now local economies are increasingly dependent on cash flows from illicit trade. You see farmers converting poppy sales into opium for resale, merchants calculating risk versus profit, and entire regions shifting away from subsistence crops toward cash crops designed to feed addiction. Even regions untouched by foreign trade feel the pressure. Market fluctuations, demand for silver, and smuggling networks influence local decision-making. The empire's fiscal stability teeters, and you feel of the fragility as a physical weight pressing down across the landscape. Here's a quirky observation. Some communities developed rituals around opium consumption that mimic traditional festivals, blending superstition with addiction. You see villagers lighting incense, singing quietly, and passing pipes during seasonal celebrations, claiming spiritual or protective benefits. It's both poignant and darkly humorous, a desperate attempt to integrate a destructive habit into the rhythm of life. These adaptations highlight human resilience but also underscore the deep moral and social compromises being made. Meanwhile, urban centres face parallel pressures. You wander through city markets where opium dens flourish alongside traditional trade, soldiers patrol unevenly, and merchants attempt to navigate foreign-imposed trade agreements. The streets pulse with smoke and commerce, a chaotic mix of vice and necessity. You sense a subtle but pervasive transformation. Social hierarchies are distorted, authority is inconsistent, and traditional values clash with economic survival. The empire's once orderly urban life now teeters on the edge of disorder, its rhythm dictated by the interplay of addiction, commerce, and the pressure of foreign powers. Historians continue to debate the long-term impact of opium on rural society. Some argue that it created dependency patterns that weakened China's capacity to resist both internal and external threats. Others suggest that the problem was less about the substance itself and more about economic mismanagement, population pressure, and systemic corruption. You feel the tension in this debate as you observe villages struggling to sustain themselves under conditions of scarcity and moral compromise. The truth, you realise, lies somewhere in the collision of all these forces. Socially, the erosion is not just physical but psychological. You notice villagers resigned to cycles of addiction and economic pressure, yet still clinging to community rituals, festivals, and kinship networks. Children are growing up observing parental decline. yet also learning strategies to survive in a compromised social ecosystem. You feel the subtle sadness in the air, a sense of ordinary life continuing under extraordinary stress, and realise how deeply opium has penetrated daily experience. By the early 1850s, the Qing Dynasty is confronting a dual crisis: rebellion in the countryside and widespread addiction disrupting both social order and economic stability. You walk through smouldering fields, crowded marketplaces, and quiet, tense villages, sensing the interplay between moral decay and systemic vulnerability. Opium has transformed not just the individual but at the very architecture of society, influencing decisions, relationships, and survival strategies at every level. The empire's greatest strength, the organisation of its people and resources, is now entwined with the forces that threaten to undermine it completely. In this landscape, you see both human resilience and fragility. Communities adapt, families survive, and life continues, but always under the shadow of moral, economic, and social compromise. You realise that the story of opium is inseparable from the story of China's weakening. Its social fabric, economic base, and administrative cohesion are all intertwined with addiction. The empire is no longer simply a political entity. It is a living organism struggling to endure the corrosive effects of centuries-long moral and economic erosion. You enter the opulent yet turbulent corridors of the Forbidden City once more, and a different figure commands attention now: Empress Dowager Cixi, a young but cunning woman manoeuvring behind a silk screen while the Qing dynasty teeters on the edge of chaos. You feel her presence everywhere, subtle but commanding, a reminder that power is no longer solely vested in the emperor. Dao Guang's health declines under the weight of wars, indemnities, and rebellion, and you sense that the true control of court politics is shifting. Cixi observes, manipulates, and consolidates power, carefully positioning herself while the empire flounders, a master strategist in a palace full of panic and uncertainty. The empire's challenges are compounded by the continued opium crisis. Even with Lin Zexu's earlier interventions, addiction remains pervasive, deeply rooted in urban centres, provincial towns, and among officials themselves. You walk through the streets of Beijing and see opium dens still operating quietly, their clientele now including minor officials and military officers attempting to escape stress or moral conflict. Families quietly negotiate around addiction, balancing survival with social expectations. You sense that moral authority, previously asserted through law and ritual, has been compromised. The very substance that undermined southern ports now infiltrates the empire's political and social heart. At court, debates over westernization and reform intensify. You witness ministers and scholars arguing about adopting foreign military technology, administrative practices, and industrial innovations. Others resist, asserting that China's traditional structures, Confucian values, and self-sufficiency have sustained the empire for centuries. You feel the tension between innovation and tradition, a push and pull that defines the late Qing era. The empire is forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that isolation and rigid hierarchy can no longer ensure survival in a world dominated by foreign powers and internal unrest. The social impact of opium continues to ripple outward. You observe military garrisons where soldiers smoke to dull fear or pain, bureaucrats using the drug to manage stress, and merchants relying on its trade for income. Villages depend on opium for cash flow, turning previously self-sufficient agricultural regions into economies built around addiction. You realise the empire's strength, its organised social networks, moral authority, and fiscal stability is being eroded at multiple levels, leaving a society simultaneously resilient and deeply fragile. A quirky historical note surfaces. Some elite officials experimented with controlled smoking, believing small, regulated doses could prevent moral and physical decay while maintaining social functionality. And you shake your head at the absurdity, but recognise the desperate logic. A system under siege searches for solutions that straddle morality, economics, and practical governance, however misguided. These experiments underscore the creativity and contradictions of human responses under pressure. Foreign influence grows more entrenched. You walk past new foreign enclaves in treaty ports, where Western architecture rises alongside traditional Chinese structures. Merchants, diplomats, and missionaries operate with increasing autonomy, often flouting Qing laws while benefiting from legal protections in the treaties. You feel the subtle erosion of sovereignty, the invisible hand of foreign power shaping trade, law, and cultural exchange. Opium trade, partially tolerated or taxed by local authorities, continues to circulate, linking global commerce to domestic decay. Historians still debate the balance of blame for the empire's predicament. Was the decline the inevitable result of external pressure and internal addiction, or did court politics, corruption, and resistance to reform accelerate the collapse? You feel the complexity of the question pressing on you as you observe court machinations, where personal ambition, ideology, and survival intersect in ways that make historical judgment anything but straightforward. Every decision, whether to reform, suppress, or negotiate, carries both immediate and long-term consequences. Meanwhile, the human cost is unmistakable. Families adapt to the presence of opium in daily life, children navigate addiction among adults, and entire communities shift priorities to cope with economic dependence. You sense that survival requires compromise, moral, social, and practical. Villagers, urban foreign dwellers, and officials alike navigate the tension between maintaining integrity and succumbing to systemic pressures, highlighting the pervasive influence of opium beyond individual vice. By the 1860s, it is evident that the empire's social structure has been permanently altered. Cixi's consolidation of power coincides with deepening dependency on opium, increasing foreign influence, and a bureaucracy struggling to maintain cohesion. You walk through palace corridors and provincial towns alike, sensing the pervasive interplay of addiction, political cunning, and external pressure. The Qing dynasty is no longer the untouchable monolith it once was. Instead, it is a complex, vulnerable organism, responding unevenly to crises that threaten its moral, economic, and political foundations. Even in these challenging times, there are sparks of resilience. Communities innovate, officials attempt reforms, and military leaders experiment with new technologies. You notice small victories, temporary recoveries, and moral gestures that hint at the empire's capacity to endure, even as systemic weaknesses remain glaring. The tension between decay and survival, tradition and adaptation, dominates daily life. You feel history unfolding in real time, a living, breathing organism caught between collapse and reinvention, with opium at the center of its struggles. You step into the debates raging in the halls of the Forbidden City and provincial offices, and it feels like walking through a storm of ideas, fear, and indecision. The question on everyone's lips is simple yet impossible: westernization or decay? You watch officials argue passionately over whether to adopt foreign military technology, modernize naval fleets, reform taxation, or restructure provincial administration. Some advocate for cautious adaptation, borrowing only what is necessary, while others insist that embracing Western methods wholesale is the only way to survive. The tension is almost tangible, thickening the air like the smog that curls from opium dens in the streets below. The empire is under siege on multiple fronts. Opium addiction continues to sap both economic and human capital, with silver flowing outward to pay for the very substance that undermines social cohesion. You observe soldiers sluggish from consumption, bureaucrats distracted and compromised, and local economies reliant on opium cultivation. Even as reformist officials push for modernization, they are hamstrung by systemic corruption, entrenched traditions, and resistance from conservative factions. You feel the subtle rhythm of an empire caught between necessity and ideology, where every policy debate carries consequences that could ripple across provinces and generations. In the streets, daily life is a delicate negotiation. Families hedge against economic instability caused by opium trade and foreign influence, adjusting cultivation, labour, and spending patterns. You notice communities creating informal social contracts around opium use, rationing it or designating discrete spaces for consumption to maintain social order. Children observe adults' habits, adopting a nuanced understanding of morality, survival, and compromise. You sense that opium is no longer merely a substance. It has become embedded in social logic, influencing behaviour, expectations, and cultural norms. Here's a quirky, almost absurd detail. Some conservative officials, in a blend of moralism and desperation, propose controlled opium zones where use is permitted under strict supervision, believing it could mitigate addiction's worst effects while maintaining law and order. You can't help but marvel at the ingenuity and contradictions of this idea, practical, morally conflicted, and utterly indicative of an empire grappling with unprecedented challenges. It is a vivid reminder that policy, morality, and survival often intersect in unexpected ways. foreign influence continues to expand in parallel. Treaty ports flourish as centres of commerce, with British, French, and later American merchants operating under protections that bypass traditional imperial oversight. You walk past docks crowded with goods, silver, and people, sensing the subtle erosion of sovereignty as foreign powers enforce their economic interests with both diplomacy and military presence. The opium trade thrives in this environment, legally tolerated or covertly ignored, and serves as a link between global markets and the empire's internal vulnerabilities. The interplay between domestic weakness and foreign advantage is undeniable. Historians still argue over whether the Qing dynasty could have effectively modernized or reasserted control during this period. Some contend that systemic rigidity, corruption, and social dependence on opium made meaningful reform nearly impossible. Others argue that decisive leadership and selective adoption of Western technologies could have slowed or even reversed decline. You feel the tension of these debates as you witness the painstakingly slow pace of reform. Arsenals rebuilt, small-scale industrial experiments, naval training programs, all promising yet insufficient in the face of overwhelming systemic and social challenges. The human cost remains profound. You walk through provincial towns where addiction shapes daily rhythms, labourers alternate between productivity and stupor, and social hierarchies are blurred by the interplay of wealth, dependency, and moral compromise. Families navigate economic and moral hazards, often making choices that preserve survival at the expense of health, social cohesion, or ethical ideals. You sense the persistent, corrosive influence of opium at every level of society, a force that is shaping China's future as much as any military campaign or foreign treaty. By the late 1860s, it is evident that the Qing dynasty faces a multifaceted crisis. Social structures, governance, military readiness, and economic stability are all compromised, and opium remains a persistent thread connecting each weakness. You walk through bustling marketplaces and quiet village lanes, noticing both human resilience and structural fragility. The empire is no longer just politically challenged. It is morally, economically, and socially contested from within and without. The tension between tradition and adaptation, morality and survival, remains unresolved, creating a precarious balance that defines the era. Even amid decay, pockets of hope emerge. Reform-minded officials experiment with industrialization, education, and infrastructure projects. Communities devise coping strategies to manage addiction and maintain economic viability. You sense that the empire's story is not one of uniform collapse, but of uneven struggle, resilience, and compromise. Opium, foreign influence, and internal debate are intertwined, shaping a complex historical landscape where survival is contingent, moral clarity is scarce, and every choice carries profound consequences. The stage is set for further conflict, both internal and external, and you feel the tension building toward the next chapter of China's dramatic transformation. You find yourself in a transformed China, where opium is no longer simply a personal vice but a regulated commodity, entwined with imperial finances. In some provinces, the Qing government, pressured by economic realities, decides to legalize opium under strict taxation, hoping to extract revenue while reducing illicit trade. You watch officials meticulously recording shipments, levying duties, and attempting to monitor consumption. The streets hum with cautious activity, a mix of smugglers turned semi-legitimate merchants, labourers, and families negotiating survival under the new rules. It's a pragmatic, if morally conflicted, approach, a calculated compromise between economic necessity and societal damage. Even with legalization, the social consequences are undeniable. Addiction continues to infiltrate households, offices, and military posts. You notice soldiers pausing mid-drill, their movements slowed by habitual smoking, bureaucrats leaning over ledgers, red-eyed and unsteady, and families balancing subsistence farming with small-scale cultivation to meet local demand. Opium has embedded itself so thoroughly that its presence dictates the rhythms of life. Labour, commerce, and morality now revolve around this golden brown resin. You feel the duality. The government seeks control, yet dependence ensures that enforcement is always partial, incomplete, and ethically fraught. The economy adapts in unexpected ways. Farmers grow poppy as a profitable cash crop, feeding both domestic demand and international trade. Merchants thrive on taxation systems, While local markets fluctuate according to both legality and smuggling, you sense a subtle paradox. The government benefits financially from opium, while the same substance undermines social cohesion and moral authority. Villagers negotiate constantly, balancing survival, profit, and family obligations. The empire's economic resilience is intertwined with a system that simultaneously corrodes the social fabric. A quirky historical anecdote emerges. In some coastal towns, officials established opium inspection bureaus, complete with detailed charts, sampling procedures, and even moral lectures for smokers. You imagine the absurdity. Bureaucrats lecturing addicts while tallying chests, blending moral suasion with regulatory oversight. It's a striking example of the empire's contradictory response, enforcing morality and legality while acknowledging the practical impossibility of total eradication. Meanwhile, foreign influence continues to expand, particularly in treaty ports where Western powers assert commercial and legal privileges. You walk past shipping docks, warehouses, and trading houses, noticing a complex network of exchange. Silver, tea, textiles, and opium circulating with semi-official sanction. The Qing government attempts oversight, but the sheer scale of trade, combined with entrenched corruption, ensures that the enforcement is imperfect. You sense that the empire's authority is being continuously negotiated, challenged, and reshaped by both domestic and foreign actors. Historians debate whether legalization slowed or exacerbated the crisis. Some argue that taxation reduced black market incentives and allowed for partial control, while others contend that it normalized addiction and entrenched dependency in both urban and rural populations. You feel the tension in this argument, understanding that policy can rarely resolve deep-seated social and economic patterns without trade-offs, particularly when a substance as addictive and culturally embedded as opium is involved. Socially, families continue to navigate the presence of opium in daily life. Children learn to observe parental habits, farmers allocate time between cultivation and consumption, and entire communities establish informal rules to minimize harm while maximizing profit. You realize that opium has reshaped interpersonal dynamics, economic decision-making, and local governance. Even as the state exerts partial control, the substance exerts a subtle, pervasive influence that affects morality, productivity, and social cohesion. At the provincial level, local officials struggle to maintain order. You observe magistrates balancing tax collection with enforcement, soldiers maintaining patrols despite addiction, and rural leaders mediating disputes related to opium trade and consumption. The empire's administrative machinery is stretched thin, negotiating between moral authority, economic pragmatism, and social necessity. You sense the tension in every decision. The cost of failure is social unrest, economic disruption, or loss of legitimacy. By the late 1860s, it becomes clear that opium has become a structural element of governance. You watch bureaucrats, families, and merchants interact in a complex ecosystem, where regulation, commerce, and addiction are inseparably intertwined. The empire survives, yet in a precarious equilibrium, resilient in some ways, deeply vulnerable in others. You sense that opium's influence is no longer merely incidental. It has reshaped the economic, social, and moral architecture of the Qing dynasty. Even in this period of adaptation, the long-term consequences are evident. The empire's authority is diluted, foreign influence entrenched, and internal cohesion weakened. You feel history pressing against every province, city, and household, a constant reminder that practical compromises can secure survival but rarely restore former glory. Opium, once a contraband, now binds the empire's economy, society, and governance together, creating both lifelines and vulnerabilities that will define China's path for decades to come. You walk through bustling ports and provincial towns in the 1870s and sense a China caught between survival and decay. The legalization of opium has created a delicate, morally complex balance. Revenue flows steadily into imperial coffers, yet addiction continues to undermine health, productivity, and social cohesion. Farmers prioritize poppy cultivation over food crops, while merchants profit from the regulated trade, and families adjust daily routines around consumption. You notice children learning to navigate an environment where dependence is normalized, soldiers and officials staggering between duty and habit, and local communities improvising social rules to maintain stability. The empire functions, but it functions differently, adapted to dependency rather than resisting it. Economically, opium has become a linchpin of both local and national finances. You observe provincial treasuries counting silver, allocating resources, and funding campaigns against rebellion. Yet every coin comes with the hidden cost of societal erosion. Local economies flourish superficially, markets thrive, transport networks hum, and merchants calculate profits with precision. Yet underneath, dependency distorts labour patterns, agricultural priorities, and long-term productivity. You feel the paradox in every corner. Opium sustains the empire financially while simultaneously undermining its moral and social foundations. The Qing court debates the balance between pragmatic governance and moral authority with increasing intensity. You sit in council chambers filled with maps, ledgers, and reports from distant provinces. Some officials argue that continued taxation and regulation are the only feasible options to maintain stability, while others insist that moral restoration demands stricter enforcement and education campaigns. You sense the tension. Every policy is a compromise. Every decision carries both immediate and long-term consequences. The empire's authority is no longer absolute. It is negotiated continuously, contingent on the interaction between law, custom, and commerce. On the streets, daily life is shaped by this new reality. Opium dens operate openly, often under the watchful eyes of local authorities collecting taxes. Families balance the economic benefits of poppy cultivation with the destructive impact of addiction. Villagers devise creative strategies to maintain productivity while managing consumption, from rotating labour to rationing opium internally. You feel the subtle social engineering taking place. Communities adapt, survive, and sometimes even thrive within a system that is inherently corrosive, illustrating human resilience under morally and economically challenging conditions. Here's a quirky anecdote. Some officials host moral lectures in opium dens, preaching moderation while tallying taxes. You can almost picture the scene: smoky rooms, incense curling alongside exhaled fumes, and officials lecturing the very people who provide the state's revenue. It's simultaneously absurd and poignant, a visual metaphor for the contradictions shaping Qing governance during this period. The empire enforces morality with one hand while financially benefiting from what it morally condemns. Meanwhile, foreign influence is increasingly entrenched. Treaty ports flourish as centres of Western trade, law, and culture. You walk past warehouses stacked with imported goods, shipping manifests detailing trade in silver and opium, and diplomatic compounds where foreign powers negotiate privileges beyond imperial oversight. The Qing administration attempts to manage the flow, yet enforcement remains partial and inconsistent. The empire's sovereignty is constrained not just by treaties but by the structural integration of foreign commerce into its economy, reinforcing both dependence and vulnerability. Historians still debate the long-term consequences of this period. Some argue that legalization stabilized the empire's finances and allowed for partial control over smuggling and addiction. Others contend that normalization entrenched dependency, weakening moral authority and social cohesion. You feel the tension between pragmatic survival and ethical compromise, recognizing that neither approach fully addresses the deeper structural vulnerabilities that opium has exposed. The empire's decisions in this period are a testament to the difficulty of governing a vast, complex society under external pressure and internal erosion. Socially, the patterns established during this era are striking. Families adapt around addiction, labourers time work with consumption, and officials attempt to maintain order in a population simultaneously dependent and compliant. You sense the subtle influence of opium on governance, commerce, and culture. It shapes decisions, habits, and social hierarchies. The substance is no longer a peripheral concern and is woven into the very fabric of imperial life, influencing both policy and daily survival. By the late 1870s, the Qing dynasty is visibly changed. Opium is regulated, foreign influence entrenched, and internal governance increasingly pragmatic, morally compromised, and reliant on a delicate balance of enforcement and tolerance. You walk through urban and rural landscapes alike, sensing the interplay of dependency, authority, and adaptation. The empire survives, but it survives differently, shaped irrevocably by the decades of addiction, trade, and negotiation. Its moral and social authority is permanently altered, yet its resilience persists in surprising and uneven ways. Even amid compromise, glimpses of reform and resilience emerge. Officials experiment with modern military technology, infrastructure projects, and education programs. Villages adapt to labour and consumption demands while attempting to maintain cohesion. You feel the tension between continuity and transformation, understanding that opium has not only weakened the empire, but also forced it to adapt creatively in order to endure. The stage is set for future challenges as the Qing dynasty navigates a complex web of dependency, foreign influence, and internal reform. You step into the 1880s and immediately sense the Qing dynasty walking a tightrope between modernization and moral compromise. The empire's response to foreign pressure is uneven. In some areas, Western military drills and arsenals emerge, while in others, traditional hierarchies resist any change. You notice soldiers training with modern rifles alongside older muskets, and provincial governors juggling revenue from opium taxes with the need to enforce laws. Every day seems like an exercise in balancing practicality, survival, and morality, a tension made more complex by the pervasive influence of opium on both the economy and society. The opium trade continues to underpin local and imperial finances. You walk through towns where silver flows steadily from sales, taxes, and duties, yet simultaneously fuels widespread addiction. Farmers cultivate poppies alongside essential crops, creating an economy that is both dependent and destabilized. Merchants profit, bureaucrats rely on revenues, and soldiers are caught between duty and habitual consumption. You sense the delicate, almost precarious equilibrium. The empire benefits from opium, even as the same substance erodes its workforce, moral authority, and social cohesion. Social consequences extend beyond addiction alone. You see communities negotiating labour and consumption patterns to maintain productivity. Families hedge against economic volatility, children adapt to parental dependence, and village leaders mediate disputes arising from both legal and illicit trade. Even small towns have evolved informal rules around opium use, rationing consumption, and designating spaces to reduce social conflict. You realise that opium is now embedded in governance, social structure, and culture, shaping behaviour at every level. At court, debates about reform intensify. Officials argue over adopting Western industrial, military, and educational models. Some see reform as the only path to survival. Others resist, believing that tradition and Confucian values must guide the empire. You feel the tension between adaptation and preservation in every discussion, every memorandum, and every strategic plan. Opium, foreign influence, and internal unrest intertwine, making each policy choice fraught with moral, economic, and social consequences. A quirky observation emerges. Some local officials establish opium rationing boards, assigning consumption limits to households and attempting to regulate distribution while collecting taxes. You can almost picture the bureaucratic absurdity. Smoky rooms, ledger books, and moral lectures all rolled into one administration. Yet the system reflects the pragmatic logic of the era. Control what you can, profit where possible, and mitigate harm where feasible, however imperfectly. Meanwhile, foreign powers continue to assert influence. Treaty ports flourish as centres of commerce, law, and culture. Shipping, silver, and trade flow freely, often under conditions that bypass imperial oversight. You sense that sovereignty is no longer absolute. Authority is continually negotiated, contested, and sometimes ignored. Opium remains central to these networks, linking domestic dependency with global commerce in ways the Qing administration struggles to manage. Historians continue to debate whether these decades of adaptation preserved the empire or merely delayed collapse. Some argue that pragmatic regulation and selective modernization allowed the Qing to endure longer than expected. Others insist that normalization of opium consumption entrenched dependency, eroded moral authority, and weakened social cohesion, leaving the empire perpetually vulnerable. You feel the tension of these debates as you walk through urban markets and rural villages, witnessing resilience and fragility coexisting uneasily. The human dimension is striking. Families manage addiction, negotiate labour, and adapt to economic and social realities shaped by opium. Soldiers continue to function under dual pressures of duty and consumption, while bureaucrats attempt to maintain authority amidst systemic corruption. You sense the pervasiveness of opium's influence. It is no longer simply a vice, but a structural element shaping the empire's political, social, and economic decisions. By the late 1880s, the Qing dynasty has adapted, but at considerable cost. You observe an empire resilient in some respects, yet fundamentally altered. Its moral authority compromised, social cohesion tenuous, and economic systems both dependent on and undermined by opium. Walking through provincial towns, trading hubs, and palace corridors, You sense a delicate balance between survival and vulnerability. Every policy, every decision, every family adaptation reflects the complex interplay of necessity, morality, and human resilience. Even amid moral compromise and dependency, sparks of reform persist. Modern arsenals, schools, and transportation projects signal attempts to navigate global pressures while maintaining continuity. Communities continue to improvise strategies to sustain social cohesion and economic viability. You feel the tension between decay and adaptation, understanding that the Qing dynasty's resilience is fragile, contingent, and intimately tied to both opium and the empire's ability to innovate in the face of persistent crises. You step into the 1890s, and the Qing dynasty's landscape is a patchwork of resilience and instability. Modernization efforts, railways, arsenals, and schools intermingle with traditional governance, yet opium remains an invisible force shaping daily life, economics, and policy. You walk through provincial towns where farmers continue to grow poppy alongside staple crops, merchants profit from trade, and families adapt to the rhythms of addiction. Soldiers struggle to maintain discipline while relying on opium to manage stress, and bureaucrats navigate the contradiction of benefiting from a substance that simultaneously erodes social cohesion. The empire functions, but its rhythm has changed fundamentally, dictated by both necessity and compromise. In the treaty ports, foreign influence solidifies. You notice British, French, and American trading houses controlling key aspects of commerce, while local officials attempt oversight in increasingly pragmatic and morally conflicted ways. Opium sales continue, sometimes semi-legal, sometimes covert, linking local economies to global networks in ways that strengthen dependency. Silver continues to flow outward, enriching foreign merchants while undermining imperial coffers. You feel the subtle erosion of sovereignty. Authority is constantly negotiated, contested, and tempered by both foreign interests and domestic addiction. Socially, communities are adapting in complex ways. Families create informal rules around opium use, rationing it for key adults, scheduling work to accommodate consumption, and mediating disputes arising from dependence. You notice children observing parental habits and learning strategies to survive within a system that normalizes addiction. Villages experiment with governance at the micro level, balancing economic needs, moral expectations, and social cohesion. You sense that opium is no longer just a substance, but a structural element embedded in everyday life, shaping decisions, relationships, and long-term resilience. At the court, debates over reform continue. Some officials advocate adopting Western technology wholesale, while others insist on gradual selective adaptation. You sit in council chambers observing the tension. Every policy choice is a negotiation between tradition, pragmatism, and survival. Opium, foreign influence, and internal unrest complicate decisions, forcing leaders to weigh moral authority against economic and political necessity. The dynasty's ability to adapt is uneven, and every choice carries consequences both immediate and long-term. A quirky detail emerges during these years. Some bureaucrats conduct controlled consumption experiments in provincial offices, hoping to understand social effects and prevent abuse while collecting taxes. You imagine officials puffing in backrooms, simultaneously gathering data and moralizing about moderation. A striking mix of practicality, irony, and desperation. These experiments underscore the contradictions of governance during this period, attempting to reconcile survival, morality, and control in a society deeply dependent on opium. Economically, opium continues to distort labour and agriculture. You notice farmers allocating land to poppy instead of essential crops, merchants profiting from controlled trade, and bureaucrats relying on opium taxes to fund provincial administration. Even in urban centres, the substance shapes commerce, influencing work schedules, productivity, and social behaviour. You sense the systemic integration of opium into both local economies and imperial finances, a dual-edged sword that provides revenue while undermining authority and cohesion. Historians debate whether the Qing dynasty's adaptive strategies in this period prolonged survival or entrenched dependency. Some argue that legalization, taxation, and selective modernization created the stability and partial control over social and economic systems. Others contend that dependency became entrenched, weakening moral authority, social cohesion, and long-term resilience. You feel the tension in this debate, walking through marketplaces and village squares where everyday life illustrates both human ingenuity and systemic vulnerability. The human dimension remains stark. Families, soldiers, and officials navigate daily routines shaped by opium. Children grow up understanding the substance's economic, moral, and social implications. You observe communities improvising rules, balancing consumption, and maintaining productivity. Dependency now shapes interpersonal, economic, and political behaviour, demonstrating how deeply opium is woven into the empire's fabric. By the end of the 1890s, the Qing dynasty is visibly altered. Opium remains central to economic and social life. Foreign influence continues to expand, and internal governance is a delicate balance of pragmatism, compromise, and moral negotiation. Walking through provincial towns, urban markets, and palace corridors, you sense an empire resilient yet fundamentally changed. Its authority, morality, and social cohesion are all refracted through the lens of dependency and adaptation. Every policy, every family decision, and every market transaction reflects the pervasive influence of opium on the empire's trajectory. Even amid systemic compromise, reform efforts persist. Military modernization, infrastructure projects, and education programs continue to develop unevenly. Communities improvise strategies to sustain cohesion and productivity, while the state adapts to the constraints imposed by addiction and foreign influence. You feel the tension between survival and decay, understanding that opium has shaped both vulnerability and resilience, leaving the Qing dynasty transformed in ways that will echo for decades. You step into the dawn of the 20th century, and the Qing dynasty feels like a vast ship navigating treacherous waters. The opium trade, deeply embedded in both rural and urban economies, continues to shape policy, commerce, and social life. You watch farmers tending poppy fields alongside staple crops, merchants balancing legal and illicit trade, and families negotiating daily routines around consumption. Soldiers and officials, still susceptible to addiction, attempt to maintain discipline and governance, often with mixed success. The empire survives, but it survives on a delicate balance, one that depends on both economic pragmatism and moral compromise. In the treaty ports, foreign powers expand influence even further. You walk past British, American, and French trading houses where commerce operates with relative autonomy from imperial control. Shipping, silver, and opium continue to circulate with efficiency, connecting local economies to global networks. You sense the subtle erosion of sovereignty. Chinese authority is constantly mediated through negotiation, compliance, and occasional confrontation with foreign interests. Opium is both a source of revenue and a tool of dependency, intertwining domestic stability with external influence in ways the Qing dynasty struggles to manage effectively. Socially, families continue to adapt. You observe children learning the rhythms of parental consumption, villages creating informal rules to manage addiction, and local officials improvising strategies to maintain social order. Opium use is normalized to a remarkable degree, shaping both economic decision-making and social hierarchies. The moral authority of the state is constantly tested, as it benefits from the trade while trying to limit its social damage. You feel the tension between survival, pragmatism, and ethical responsibility vibrating through everyday life, a constant undercurrent in both rural and urban China. The court grapples with reform and modernization amid these pressures. Debates rage over adopting Western military technology, industrial methods, and educational systems. Some argue for bold, comprehensive reforms to stabilize the empire and resist foreign encroachment, while others insist on gradual adaptation rooted in tradition. You sit in council chambers listening to these arguments and feel the weight of history. Every policy choice carries consequences for governance, social cohesion, and moral authority. Opium, foreign influence, and internal unrest all intertwine, creating an environment where compromise is unavoidable and failure is always a risk. A quirky historical note emerges. Some provinces implement moral education programs in tandem with opium taxation, attempting to encourage moderation through lectures, pamphlets, and community supervision. You can picture the scene: smoky dens, officials delivering lectures on temperance, and families listening while simultaneously engaging in the very trade being regulated. It's both absurd and revealing, highlighting the contradictions inherent in the Qing response, attempting to enforce morality while profiting from dependency. Economically, opium continues to distort agriculture and trade. Farmers prioritize poppy cultivation for income, merchants profit from legal and illicit sales, and provincial treasuries rely on opium-derived silver to fund administration. Urban markets similarly revolve around consumption and commerce linked to opium, creating a cycle in which economic survival and addiction are inseparably intertwined. You feel the pervasiveness of the substance shaping labour, trade, and social behaviour across the empire. Historians continue to debate whether the Qing dynasty's pragmatic approach, legalization, taxation, and selective modernization delayed collapse or entrenched structural weakness. Some argue that revenue and partial regulation provided stability. Others assert that dependency, social erosion, and moral compromise left the empire vulnerable to both internal and external pressures. You sense the unresolved tension of this debate as you walk through villages and markets, observing the consequences in real time. Resilience entwined with fragility. The human cost is stark. Families negotiate survival amid addiction, economic pressures, and foreign influence. Soldiers and bureaucrats operate under the dual pressures of duty and consumption. You notice children adapting to these conditions, learning the rules and rhythms of a society deeply shaped by opium. Dependency has become structural, influencing governance, commerce, and daily life. You feel the pervasive impact, the empire's strength, authority, and cohesion are all refracted through the prism of addiction and pragmatic compromise. By the 1900s, the Qing dynasty is visibly changed. Opium continues to influence economics, social patterns, and governance. Foreign influence is entrenched, and internal reform is uneven. Walking through provincial towns, urban markets, and palace corridors, you sense a China transformed, resilient in some ways, deeply vulnerable in others. Every decision, policy, economic or personal, is shaped by decades of dependency, adaptation, and negotiation. The empire survives, but it survives differently, with moral authority, social cohesion, and sovereignty all permanently altered. Even amid these challenges, pockets of reform and innovation persist. Military modernization, infrastructure projects, and educational experiments continue, albeit unevenly. Villages and urban communities develop coping strategies to navigate social, economic, and moral pressures. You feel the tension between continuity and change, resilience and vulnerability, understanding that opium has left its mark not just on individual lives but on the structure and trajectory of the empire itself. You step into the turbulent years of the early 20th century, and the empire feels increasingly fragile, stretched thin by decades of internal decay, foreign pressure, and opium dependence. Warlords, regional governors, and local militias wield more power than the central authority, exploiting opium trade for revenue and personal gain. You walk through provincial towns where poppy fields dominate the landscape. Families balance consumption with survival, and merchants profit from both legal taxation and clandestine smuggling. Soldiers and bureaucrats, still affected by addiction, attempt to maintain order, but the fragile equilibrium is constantly under strain. Every decision is fraught with moral, social, and economic consequences. In urban centres, the interplay between foreign influence and domestic adaptation is evident. Treaty ports thrive as hubs of international commerce where opium trade, silver transactions, and Western goods intersect. You watch British, French, and American merchants operating under legal protection, while local officials struggle to regulate a market that benefits them financially but undermines social stability. Families and labourers adapt to these pressures, balancing economic opportunity with social compromise. You feel the tension. Sovereignty is partial, dependence is structural, and survival requires navigating a morally complex landscape. Social patterns are deeply intertwined with opium. Villages devise informal systems to ration consumption, monitor social behaviour, and maintain productivity. Children grow up observing parental habits, learning strategies to cope and internalising moral compromises as practical necessities. Soldiers' efficiency is affected, bureaucrats' authority is diluted, and communities negotiate constantly between survival and ethical principles. You sense the subtle yet pervasive influence of opium on governance, labour, and culture, shaping every facet of life from household routines to provincial administration. The court grapples with reform in a climate of declining central authority. You witness debates over modernising the military, adopting industrial technology, and updating educational systems. Some officials argue that only bold, comprehensive change can stabilise the empire. Others insist on gradual adaptation while preserving tradition. The moral and practical dilemmas posed by opium, combined with foreign encroachment and internal unrest, make policy-making extraordinarily complex. Every choice has consequences across multiple levels: social, economic, and political. A quirky observation stands out. In some provinces, officials maintain opium surveillance committees, tasked with tracking consumption, while simultaneously collecting taxes and issuing moral guidance. You imagine officials puffing in smoke-filled rooms, balancing ledgers and ethics simultaneously, a blend of absurdity and pragmatism. It's a vivid illustration of the contradictions defining governance during this period, trying to regulate what sustains and undermines the state at the same time. Economically, opium continues to distort agriculture and trade. Farmers prioritize poppy cultivation to meet demand and secure silver. Merchants profit from sanctioned and illicit trade, and provincial treasuries rely on opium revenue for administration. Urban centres mirror this pattern, with consumption shaping labour productivity and market behaviour. You feel the pervasive structural integration of opium into both economic and administrative systems, a double-edged foundation sustaining survival while undermining authority and cohesion. Historians debate whether the empire's strategies in this era were stabilising or entrenching weakness. Some argue that regulation, taxation, and selective modernization provided resilience. Others insist that dependency, moral compromise, and weakened social cohesion left the dynasty vulnerable to both internal fragmentation and foreign domination. You sense the unresolved tension as you observe towns, markets, and military posts where adaptation and vulnerability coexist uneasily. The human toll remains profound. Families navigate addiction, economic instability, and moral compromise. Soldiers struggle with dependence while maintaining duties. Bureaucrats enforce rules inconsistently, balancing survival with integrity. You notice that opium is no longer peripheral, it shapes daily life, social relationships, and governance at every level. Dependency has become structural, influencing the trajectory of communities and the empire alike. By the 1910s, the Qing dynasty has been fundamentally altered. Opium continues to influence social, economic, and administrative life. Foreign influence is entrenched, and reform is inconsistent. You walk through provincial towns, markets, and palace corridors and feel the empire's resilience intertwined with deep vulnerability. Every decision, whether policy, economic, or personal, reflects decades of dependency, compromise, and adaptation. The dynasty survives, but it survives differently, shaped by opium, foreign influence, and internal complexity. Even amid decay, small sparks of reform persist. Military modernization, infrastructure projects, and educational experiments continue unevenly, while communities improvise strategies to sustain cohesion and productivity. You feel the tension between tradition and adaptation, moral compromise and survival, understanding that opium has left a lasting imprint on both the social and structural foundations of the Qing dynasty. The empire endures, yet its endurance is precarious, morally fraught, and inseparably linked to the substance that has shaped its destiny for over a century. You step into the era of Mao's early campaigns and witness a China determined to eradicate the remnants of opium's grip. After centuries of addiction shaping social, economic, and political life, a new wave of leadership confronts the substance with unparalleled force. You watch as officials, soldiers, and local cadres enforce strict anti-opium policies, conducting mass confiscations, public trials, and even executions. Villages and towns that once thrived on cultivation and trade are forced to adapt rapidly, shifting agriculture back toward food crops and industries that serve collective goals. You feel the intensity of this moral and practical purge, an attempt to reclaim authority, restore social cohesion, and redefine public morality after generations of compromise and dependence. The scope of enforcement is extraordinary. Opium dens are shuttered, smugglers are prosecuted, and entire regions experience campaigns designed to obliterate addiction. You walk through confiscation sites where tons of opium are destroyed, their pungent smoke rising into the air as both warning and spectacle. Soldiers patrol rural and urban areas, ensuring compliance and educating the populace. The scale of operation is overwhelming, reflecting both the moral clarity and the authoritarian reach of the new regime. You sense that this is not simply law enforcement. It is a radical attempt to reshape society itself. Socially, the effects are immediate and far-reaching. Families dependent on poppy cultivation and consumption face economic disruption, yet the campaigns provide opportunities for reinvention. Farmers revert to staple crops, villages negotiate new labour arrangements, and communities learn to rely less on vice and more on collective productivity. Children and young adults, previously raised amidst normalised opium use, now witness both enforcement and rehabilitation programs. You feel the dramatic cultural shift. Addiction, once embedded in daily life, is now framed as both morally and socially unacceptable, reshaping social norms across generations. A quirky, almost darkly humorous detail emerges. In some provinces, enforcement officials organise public anti-opium festivals, featuring speeches, ceremonial destruction of opium, and communal rituals meant to educate and entertain. You imagine the spectacle: villagers gathering to witness destruction, officials lecturing, smoke curling into the sky, and a sense of moral drama enacted like theatre. It's simultaneously performative and effective, a culturally resonant strategy to embed the anti-opium message deeply into collective consciousness. Economically, the purge reshapes local and regional systems. Silver that previously flowed through opium taxation and trade is redirected toward collective projects, military support, and industrial development. Farmers adapt by producing food, fibre, and other non-addictive cash crops. Merchants adjust to legal markets, often losing prior income but gaining state-sanctioned stability. You sense the dramatic restructuring of the economy, a process both chaotic and purposeful, aimed at breaking the cycle of dependence that had defined China for over a century. Historians debate the ethical and social dimensions of Mao's anti-opium campaigns. Some argue the purges were necessary to restore social order and national sovereignty, while others critique the use of authoritarian enforcement, mass executions, and coerced compliance. You feel the complexity of the moment. Moral clarity and social necessity collide with authoritarian methods, producing both dramatic successes and enduring controversies. The campaigns are transformative yet morally and socially fraught. At the provincial and village level, daily life is reconfigured. Families who once depended on poppy for income and coping mechanisms must adapt to new social and economic realities. Soldiers and cadres enforce regulations while promoting education, labour reform, and alternative livelihoods. Communities improvise ways to maintain cohesion and stability, sometimes bending rules creatively, while adhering to overarching state objectives. You sense the tension between compliance, survival, and adaptation as a constant undercurrent in daily life. The cultural impact is profound. You notice that opium's prior normalization is replaced by moral messaging, communal oversight, and public pedagogy. Children internalize a different set of values. Communities restructure economies, and social hierarchies adjust to a system less dependent on addiction. You sense the long shadow of change. A society that once accommodated a pervasive vice now experiences its removal as both liberation and disruption. By the mid-20th century, China is confronting the long ghost of opium. Addiction rates decline dramatically. Silver previously lost to trade is partially restored to state projects, and moral authority is reinforced through decisive enforcement. Yet you feel the cultural memory persist. The centuries-long influence of opium has left indelible marks on governance, social practices, and economic behaviour. The eradication is effective, but it cannot erase the structural and psychological legacies of a substance that once shaped an empire from its economy to its households. Even amid punitive measures and moral campaigns, resilience and adaptation emerge. Communities rebuild, reform-minded officials experiment with economic and social innovations, and infrastructure projects begin to stabilize society. You feel the tension between restoration and memory. The empire, or what remains of it, is physically and socially recovering, yet the lessons of opium continue to influence policy, culture, and consciousness. The stage is set for a new China, one attempting to reconcile centuries of dependence with aspirations for sovereignty, stability, and moral renewal. You wander through post-purge China, and the remnants of opium addiction linger like a faint, stubborn fog. Even after decades of strict enforcement, the cultural and psychological impacts are evident. Families that once relied on poppy for income or coping mechanisms have adapted, yet the memory of addiction shapes social expectations, labour habits, and intergenerational behaviour. Villages are quieter, markets are reoriented toward legitimate commerce, and soldiers regain discipline, but traces of the past persist in subtle ways. Smoky relics of dens, stories passed down, and cautious behaviour around silver and trade. You sense that history does not vanish with policy. It leaves marks that endure in the everyday rhythms of life. Economically, the empire, now a nation-state under a new order, is in recovery. Farmers shift back to staple crops, local markets re-establish stability, and provincial treasuries redirect revenue toward development rather than addiction. You watch merchants rebuilding livelihoods while avoiding prior dependence on opium profits, yet the transition is neither easy nor complete. Trade networks remain fragile, communities adjust slowly, and old habits occasionally resurface. You feel the subtle interplay between reform and residual legacy, understanding that systemic change takes far longer than the decrees or campaigns can enforce. Socially, the legacy of opium is evident in behavioural patterns. Children who grew up observing parental addiction navigate moral, economic, and social decisions differently than previous generations. Families, having endured cycles of dependency and enforcement, internalise lessons about discipline, responsibility, and risk. Soldiers and bureaucrats, once compromised by use, regain authority, yet the shadow of prior reliance informs contemporary culture. You sense the psychological residue of centuries of opium shaping attitudes toward governance, commerce, and morality. A quirky detail emerges. In some regions, local festivals incorporate symbolic rituals reflecting past addiction, using mock pipes or ceremonial burning to remind communities of prior dangers while reinforcing moral lessons. You imagine the blend of humour, ritual, and pedagogy, creative, almost theatrical way of embedding collective memory into social practice. It's a reminder that cultural adaptation and storytelling are powerful tools in shaping community behaviour long after the original crisis has ended. At the national level, leadership emphasises moral and social restoration alongside economic redevelopment. Campaigns educate citizens about addiction, promote agricultural reform, and reorganise labour patterns disrupted by prior dependence. You walk through villages where cadres teach new skills, reconstruct community infrastructure, and enforce social norms that prioritise public welfare. The combination of education, enforcement, and economic restructuring aims to repair both the material and moral fabric of society. Historians continue to debate the extent to which post-purge policies reshaped Chinese society. Some argue that eradication programs were decisive in restoring order, discipline, and moral authority. Others contend that cultural and psychological legacies of opium persisted for decades, subtly influencing family structures, labour practices, and social expectations. You feel the nuance in these debates as you observe communities negotiating continuity, change, and memory in everyday life. Meanwhile, economic recovery is uneven. Regions previously reliant on opium cultivation experience both relief and hardship. Farmers regain food security, yet they must adapt to markets no longer centred on a lucrative cash crop. Urban centres recalibrate trade priorities, investing in industrial, agricultural, and infrastructural projects. You feel the deliberate, painstaking reconstruction of economic systems, a process that demands coordination, discipline, and long-term planning. The empire's, or rather the nation's, resilience is tested in both practical and psychological terms. Socially, communities rebuild cohesion. Families navigate the absence of dependency while attempting to maintain economic stability. Village councils enforce regulations, negotiate disputes, and embed lessons from the past into governance structures. You notice that collective memory of opium reinforces community vigilance, moral education, and attention to labour allocation. It is both a cautionary and guiding influence, ensuring that past vulnerabilities inform contemporary strategies for survival and prosperity. By the mid-20th century, the influence of opium has shifted from active threat to historical shaping force. You walk through rebuilt towns, observe disciplined soldiers, and see thriving markets that reflect both resilience and adaptation. Yet every corner bears traces of memory, stories, rituals, habits, and social norms shaped by generations living with the substance. You sense that the psychological, cultural, and structural impact of opium endures, even after the material presence has been largely eradicated. Even amid reconstruction, lessons from opium continue to influence policy, culture, and social behaviour. Leadership focuses on preventing relapse into dependency, promoting moral education, and embedding resilience into economic and social systems. communities adapt, innovate, and preserve collective memory. You feel the tension between recovery and remembrance. China survives and rebuilds, but the ghost of opium lingers as both a warning and a formative influence on the nation's emerging identity. You pause to reflect on the persistent question that haunts scholars and citizens alike. Who is truly responsible for the devastation opium inflicted on China? You wander through provincial archives, village memorials, and market streets, realizing that blame is complex and multifaceted. Some point to British imperialism, emphasizing the calculated trade and military coercion that forced opium into Chinese society. Others focus on Qing officials, arguing that corruption, indecision, and delayed enforcement exacerbated the crisis. Still others highlight societal factors, the human desire for escape, economic pressures on rural populations, and cultural practices that enabled widespread adoption. You feel the subtle truth: no single actor can bear the full weight. It is a web of decisions, policies, and behaviours stretching across decades and continents. Socially, the question of responsibility shapes memory and moral reflection. Families recount the choices of ancestors, some who participated in trade, some who succumbed to addiction, and some who resisted. You see communities navigating these narratives, balancing pride, shame, and practical lessons. Historical memory is both cautionary and instructive. It informs governance, education, and interpersonal ethics. You feel that opium's legacy is not only physical or economic, but deeply psychological, influencing how communities and individuals evaluate responsibility, morality, and collective experience. Economically, the debate also resonates. You observe merchants and officials discussing policies in light of the past, how trade networks were distorted, silver drained, and local economies reshaped to accommodate addiction. Some argue that regulatory failures created long-term structural weaknesses. Others insist that foreign pressures made these failures inevitable. You sense that economic consequences are inseparable from moral and social questions, reinforcing the interdependence of policy, behaviour, and societal health. Every ledger, trade route, and village tax system carries echoes of choices made over the preceding century. A quirky historical aside emerges. In some towns, residents maintain opium blame chronicles, informal accounts of who was involved in past trade or consumption, sometimes framed as local folklore. You imagine families passing down these records, mixing fact, rumour, and moral lesson. It's an unusual method of social accountability, blending history, memory, and cultural pedagogy, ensuring that collective consciousness preserves both cautionary tales and ethical frameworks. At the national level, the legacy of responsibility shapes governance and reform. Leaders study the failures of the past to design policies aimed at avoiding repetition. Strict anti-addiction laws, education programs, and economic restructuring. You notice provincial officers referencing historical cases when making enforcement decisions, integrating lessons into administrative practice. The empire, or the modernizing state that follows, uses the past as both a moral guide and a practical blueprint, demonstrating how historical analysis informs contemporary policy. Historians debate whether the opium crisis was primarily caused by external aggression, internal weakness, or societal susceptibility. Some emphasize British trade and military coercion as decisive, others highlight Qing indecision, local corruption, and systemic inefficiencies. Still others point to social and cultural factors that facilitated consumption and dependence. You feel the complexity of this discussion, realizing that historical causation is rarely linear. Each factor interacts with others, creating a chain of consequences that magnifies small decisions into sweeping social transformation. The human dimension of responsibility is evident in everyday life. Families reconcile past participation, losses, and survival strategies. Villages navigate moral judgments while reconstructing social cohesion. Children grow up learning both caution and resilience from ancestral experience. You sense the profound intertwining of moral, social, and economic reflection. Understanding who was responsible is inseparable from understanding how society recovers, adapts, and preserves continuity. By the early 20th century, the question of responsibility informs education, governance, and cultural practice. Moral lessons are embedded in community rituals, school curricula, and official discourse. You walk through towns where reminders of opium's impact are visible. Memorials, folklore, and public education efforts all emphasize accountability, historical awareness, and prevention. The substance's legacy continues to shape collective consciousness, long after physical eradication. Even amid reconstruction and modernization, the debate about responsibility shapes both national identity and policy. Leaders, communities, and individuals alike wrestle with questions of moral, economic, and political accountability. You feel the persistent tension between assigning blame, learning from history, and forging resilience. Opium, though largely eradicated physically, continues to influence how society conceptualizes governance, morality, and survival. Its shadow endures in both memory and action. You watch as the empire's decline accelerates in slow motion, and the signs are unmistakable. Even after decades of opium taxation, foreign encroachment, and intermittent reform, the Qing dynasty is unraveling. Provincial governors exercise increasing autonomy, warlords build personal armies, and social cohesion frays as families and communities grapple with economic hardship and moral dislocation. You walk through provincial capitals where once orderly markets now bustle with informal trade. Opium remnants persist quietly in villages, and labour patterns remain influenced by past dependency. The empire's authority, once absolute, is now contested on multiple fronts, socially, economically, and politically, and every step forward feels precarious. The cumulative effect of opium, foreign treaties, and internal rebellion becomes undeniable. You pass ruined towns and scarred landscapes, where the legacy of the Taiping Rebellion and repeated conflicts manifests in both physical destruction and social trauma. Soldiers remain disciplined in some areas, yet elsewhere militia forces operate independently, leveraging opium revenues and local loyalty to wield power outside imperial oversight. Bureaucratic networks falter under the strain of competing priorities: taxation, moral enforcement, and regional security. You sense the subtle collapse of coordination that once bound a vast empire together. Socially, ordinary people navigate an environment of constant negotiation. Families adapt labour, consumption, and education to survive in conditions shaped by dependency and instability. You notice children observing parental compromise, learning strategies for survival that blend moral judgment with pragmatism. Community networks enforce informal rules, mediate disputes, and sustain cohesion where formal structures fail. Opium, though largely eradicated physically, continues to influence social behaviour, decision-making, and local governance, a reminder of the enduring power of long-term structural dependence. A quirky historical note illustrates the strange persistence of opium's influence. In some northern villages, elderly residents preserved small ceremonial pipes as symbols of past hardship, using them in rituals to educate youth about moral vigilance. You imagine the combination of humour, superstition, and social pedagogy, a cultural mechanism to preserve lessons while maintaining continuity. It's a striking example of how a substance can leave a mark on collective consciousness long after its active presence fades. Economically, the empire struggles to stabilise. Silver that once flowed outward to pay for opium and indemnities now circulates in recovery, yet fiscal systems remain fragile. Farmers attempt to restore food production, merchants pivot back to legal markets, and provincial treasuries struggle to fund both infrastructure and security. You feel the intricate balance between recovery and vulnerability. Systems rebuilt from necessity are stronger in some ways, yet deeply influenced by centuries of compromise and dependency. The empire's resilience is tangible but precarious, a patchwork of adaptive strategies and residual weakness. At the court, debates about modernization, foreign influence, and governance intensify. Officials grapple with balancing traditional authority against practical reforms, attempting to preserve legitimacy while navigating internal unrest and international pressure. You sit in council rooms imagining the weight of decisions. Every policy must contend with past failures, lingering addiction, and fractured authority. The empire's ability to enact coherent governance is strained, yet reform-minded leaders attempt incremental adaptation, aware that missteps could accelerate decline. Historians continue to debate whether the Qing dynasty's collapse was inevitable or delayed by centuries of adaptation. Some argue that opium dependency, corruption, and foreign intervention created structural vulnerabilities that made decline unavoidable. Others contend that reform, taxation, and pragmatic adaptation allowed the empire to survive far longer than expected. You feel the tension of this debate as you walk through cities and villages, observing the interplay between resilience and fragility, survival and vulnerability, adaptation and collapse. By the turn of the 20th century, the empire's trajectory is unmistakable. Opium's influence, both direct and residual, continues to shape economic, social, and political life. Families, communities, and officials navigate a complex landscape shaped by history, addiction, and adaptation. Authority is contested, sovereignty constrained, and social cohesion fragile. You sense the inevitability of transformation, yet also the resilience that allows life to continue, communities to endure, and culture to adapt. Even amid structural decline, human ingenuity persists. Villages improvise governance, families restructure economic priorities, and reform-minded officials attempt modernization. You see both the limits and the possibilities of adaptation, understanding that while the Qing dynasty's collapse is underway, the human capacity to endure and innovate continues to shape the landscape of recovery, resilience, and survival. The story of opium, far from over, has left an indelible mark on the empire and its people. You walk through a quiet Beijing courtyard, feeling the weight of history pressing in from all directions, and the final stages of the Qing dynasty's unraveling are impossible to ignore. Opium, foreign treaties, internal rebellions, and systemic corruption have combined over more than a century to reshape the empire irrevocably. Soldiers once disciplined now serve under regional warlords, bureaucrats balance survival with moral compromise, families navigate economic uncertainty and social fragmentation. You sense the culmination of decades-long forces that began with a few smuggled chests of opium on southern shores and rippled outward, reshaping every aspect of life in the empire. The grandeur of the past remains, gilded and ceremonial, but beneath it lies a fragile, tension-filled reality that cannot endure indefinitely. In the streets of provincial towns and treaty ports, the consequences of history are palpable. Markets bustle, but undercurrents of vulnerability remain. Labour patterns reflect centuries of dependency, silver circulation bears the scars of extraction, and social norms are subtly moulded by the moral compromises of generations. You notice that communities have adapted, improvising governance structures and social rules to maintain stability in a landscape permanently altered by opium. Even as the empire clings to ceremonial order, life is negotiated daily through a complex interplay of economy, morality, and survival. You feel both the resilience and the fragility of an empire that has been slowly weakened from within. Culturally, the Qing dynasty's collapse is written into rituals, stories, and collective memory. You observe families teaching children the lessons of past addiction, rebellion, and foreign intrusion. Public narratives celebrate moral vigilance, social cohesion, and the dangers of external manipulation, all framed against the backdrop of opium's long shadow. In provincial villages, symbolic remnants, ceremonial pipes, stories of confiscated chests, and local memorials serve as reminders of past crises, embedding lessons of prudence, resilience, and moral clarity into everyday life. The empire's story, once dominated by absolute authority, is now mediated through collective memory, cultural adaptation, and ongoing negotiation between tradition and survival. Economically, you sense the enduring consequences. Centuries of silver extraction, trade disruption, and dependency on opium have permanently reshaped local and regional economies. Farmers, merchants, and local officials operate within systems influenced by past practices, yet new markets, legal reforms, and infrastructural projects offer partial restoration. You observe the delicate balance between recovery and legacy. The empire's structures endure, yet are visibly scarred, reflecting a century of moral and economic compromise intertwined with survival strategies and adaptive behaviour. Historically, scholars continue to debate the Qing collapse. Was it driven by external aggression, internal corruption, social dependence, or a combination of these forces? You feel the complexity in the air as you walk among ruins, restored palaces, and lively markets. History rarely presents simple explanations. The interplay of opium, trade, foreign power, rebellion, and governance demonstrates the multifaceted pressures that can weaken even the most seemingly stable empires. You understand that causality is distributed, layered, and inextricable from both human decisions and structural conditions. The human dimension is unmistakable. You see communities balancing survival with moral reflection, families reconstructing economic priorities, and officials enforcing order while negotiating ethical compromise. The pervasive influence of opium is evident in subtle behavioral norms, labor practices, and social expectations. You sense that the substance's historical impact extends far beyond addiction. It has shaped governance, culture, and the very fabric of everyday life. Even absent from daily use, its legacy informs decisions, memory, and social cohesion. By the final years of the Qing dynasty, it is clear that centuries of challenges, foreign encroachment, internal rebellion, and opium dependence have irreversibly altered the empire's trajectory. You walk through Beijing, past courtyard gardens and ceremonial halls, feeling the tension between continuity and collapse. The empire clings to ritual, authority, and culture, yet its social, economic, and moral foundations have been transformed. Every market transaction, policy decision, and family negotiation carries echoes of the century-long struggle with opium, foreign powers, and internal decay. Even in the shadow of collapse, you notice resilience. Communities improvise governance, families rebuild economies, and reform-minded officials attempt modernization. You feel that the Qing dynasty's end is not simply a story of failure, but also one of adaptation, resistance, and survival under extraordinary pressures. Opium, foreign influence, and systemic weakness have shaped not just the empire's decline, but also the capacity of its people to endure, adjust, and carry forward lessons from a turbulent century. As you stand in the courtyard imagining the weight of history tomorrow, you realize that the story of opium and the Qing dynasty is more than a tale of addiction or conquest. It is a narrative of human resilience, systemic vulnerability, and the intertwined forces of morality, economy, and power. Walking through these spaces, you feel the enormity of what was lost, what was adapted, and what endured. The empire's grandeur persists in memory and culture, yet the lessons of opium remain, whispering through every street, home, and marketplace.